Close your eyes. Somewhere beneath the sand of Egypt, a queen is still waiting to be found. In a library that no longer exists, there is a book no one can read. Tonight, we journey through 100 mysteries that history forgot to answer. Welcome to my channel, A Quick History of Time. Before we get into the video, a hit on the like button will be appreciated, and consider subscribing for more such content. We are going to take a slow and gentle journey through 100 of history's greatest unsolved mysteries. Some of these are questions that humanity has been asking for thousands of years. Others are puzzles that modern science has only recently begun to approach, and still cannot fully answer. Let's begin. The ancient world, civilizations that vanished. We begin at the very beginning, with the ancient world. With civilizations so old that even the ruins of their ruins have turned to dust. With questions carved into stone, written into the landscape, and buried beneath the sea. The fate of the Neanderthal hybrids. For tens of thousands of years, two kinds of humans walked this earth at the same time. There was us, Homo sapiens, and there were the Neanderthals. Stocky, strong, cold-adapted, and surprisingly sophisticated. They made tools. They buried their dead. Some evidence suggests they may have created art and worn decorative ornaments. And then, around 40,000 years ago, they were gone. For a long time, scientists assumed the two species simply never mixed. That modern humans arrived in Europe and the Neanderthals slowly faded away, outcompeted, perhaps, or just unlucky. But genetic science changed everything. When researchers began sequencing ancient DNA, they found something remarkable. Most people alive today, anyone with ancestry outside of sub-Saharan Africa, carry somewhere between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA in their genome. The two groups did meet. They did interbreed. And those encounters left a mark that persists in our bodies to this very day. Some of those inherited Neanderthal genes appear to have been beneficial, affecting immune function, skin adaptation, even responses to certain viruses. Others may have come with drawbacks. But the deeper mystery remains. What happened to the Neanderthals themselves? Was it climate change? Competition for food? Disease carried by incoming human populations? Some slow blending over centuries, until distinct Neanderthal communities simply ceased to exist as a separate people? We don't know. We carry a piece of them inside us, and yet we cannot fully account for what became of them. A quiet loss, written in our DNA, still waiting to be fully understood. The meaning of the Disappearance tablet. In 1993, in a lake in northern Greece, an archaeologist named Georgos Hermousiadis was excavating the remains of a prehistoric settlement that had once stood on stilts above the water. Among the artifacts he uncovered was a small, flat piece of wood. Unremarkable at first glance. But when he looked closer, he saw that it was covered in markings, incised symbols arranged in careful rows, deliberate and patterned. The tablet was dated to approximately 5300 BCE, making it over 7,000 years old. That places it well before the invention of Sumerian cuneiform, which is widely considered the world's earliest known writing system. The symbols on the Disappearance tablet have never been deciphered. Some researchers believe they may represent an early form of writing or record-keeping. Others suggest they could be a counting system, a map, a religious inscription, or simply decorative marks with no phonetic meaning at all. Unfortunately, the tablet's exposure to air after its discovery caused it to deteriorate rapidly, complicating further analysis. What we have is a photograph of the original, a record of symbols carved by human hands in the Stone Age, communicating something we may never be able to hear. What were they trying to say? What knowledge did they want to preserve? The lake holds its silence. How the pyramids were built. The Great Pyramid of Giza was the tallest structure on Earth for nearly 4,000 years. It contains approximately 2.3 million stone blocks, some weighing as much as 80 tons. It was built to tolerances so precise that the four sides of its base differ in length by less than 8 centimeters. Its corners align almost perfectly with the four cardinal directions. And it was built around 2560 BCE, without cranes, without steel, without computer-aided design. We know who built it. Ancient texts, hieroglyphs, and archaeological evidence make clear that the pyramids were constructed by organized teams of Egyptian workers, not slaves, as was once assumed, but skilled laborers who were housed, fed, and given medical care. Their bones have been found. Their tools have been found. Their graffiti has been found, cheerfully scrawled on hidden interior stones. What we don't fully know is how. How did they cut granite with copper tools? How did they move 2.5-ton blocks across kilometers of desert with nothing but human labor and wooden sledges? How did they achieve such extraordinary precision without modern instruments? Various theories have been proposed: internal ramps, external ramps, water lubrication, counterweight systems, even experimental evidence suggesting that wetting the sand in front of sledges could dramatically reduce friction. But no single theory fully explains every aspect of the construction. The pyramids remain a testament to human ingenuity that we can admire but cannot completely replicate in our minds. They stand in the desert, patient and enormous, keeping their method to themselves. The purpose of Stonehenge. On a flat plain in the south of England, enormous stones stand in a circle. Some of them weigh up to 25 tons. They were shaped with extraordinary care. And some of them were transported from a quarry in Wales, a distance of more than 200 miles, roughly 5,000 years ago. The effort required to build Stonehenge was immense. Generations of people dedicated their lives to it. Whatever it was for, it mattered deeply. The most widely accepted theory is that Stonehenge functioned as a ceremonial and astronomical site. The monument is aligned with remarkable precision to the summer solstice sunrise and the winter solstice sunset, suggesting its builders had sophisticated knowledge of the movements of the sun. Archaeological evidence also points to it being a place associated with death and burial. Cremated human remains have been found at the site spanning centuries of use. Some researchers have proposed it was a site of healing, a kind of prehistoric pilgrimage destination where the sick traveled in search of cures. Others have suggested it served as an acoustic space, where the stones created unusual and powerful sound effects during rituals. But no written record survives. The people who built Stonehenge left no explanation, only the stones themselves, still standing in the rain and fog of the English countryside, oriented toward a sun that rises and sets in exactly the same place it did 5,000 years ago. The location of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. The ancient Greeks compiled a list of the 7 wonders of the world, the most breathtaking human constructions of the ancient era. Of those 7 wonders, only one has never been found. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon were described in ancient texts as a towering structure of terraced gardens rising high above a desert city, a cascading monument of greenery fed by an elaborate irrigation system, so lush and improbable in its arid setting that it seemed almost dreamlike. Ancient writers described them with wonder. And yet, despite extensive excavations of the city of Babylon in modern-day Iraq, no physical evidence of the gardens has ever been found. No ruins. No irrigation channels that would fit the description. No contemporary Babylonian records that even mention them. This absence has led some scholars to ask a startling question. Did the Hanging Gardens actually exist in Babylon at all? One compelling alternative theory, proposed by historian Stephanie Daly, suggests the gardens may actually have been located in the Assyrian city of Nineveh, hundreds of miles to the north, and that over centuries of retelling, the location was misremembered or deliberately reattributed. Evidence from Nineveh does suggest the presence of elaborate garden waterworks. But the question remains open. One of the 7 wonders of the world may be in the wrong place on every map that has ever been drawn. The disappearance of the Sea Peoples. Around 1200 BCE, the Mediterranean world collapsed. In the space of a few decades, some of the most powerful civilizations of the ancient world, the Mycenaean Greeks, the Hittites, the kingdoms of Cyprus and Ugarit, crumbled and vanished. Trade networks that had functioned for centuries fell apart. Cities were abandoned or burned. A centuries-long dark age descended over the region. Ancient Egyptian records from this period speak of a terrifying enemy, a coalition of seafaring peoples who swept in from the sea and overwhelmed everything in their path. The Egyptians called them the Sea Peoples. Who were they? Where did they come from? And where did they go? Scholars have proposed many origins: displaced populations from the Aegean, Anatolia, or even as far as the Italian peninsula. Some believe the Sea Peoples were themselves victims of the collapse, refugees set in motion by climate change, drought, or political upheaval, who then became a force of destruction in their own desperate search for new homes. What happened to them afterward is equally unclear. Some may have settled along the coast of Canaan and become the Philistines of biblical history. Others may have dispersed and assimilated into the cultures they had helped to destroy. They arrive in the historical record like a wave, reshape the world, and then recede, leaving only the wreckage and the question of who they really were. The disappearance of the Mycenaean Linear B scribes. Linear B is one of the oldest known writing systems in Europe. It was used by the Mycenaean civilization of ancient Greece, the world of Achilles and Agamemnon, of bronze armor and great walled citadels, to keep administrative records. Inventories of goods. Lists of workers and soldiers. Tallies of livestock and grain. Linear B was deciphered in 1952 by a British architect named Michael Ventris, in one of the great intellectual achievements of the 20th century. And what it revealed was largely mundane, the paperwork of a Bronze Age palace economy. But when the Mycenaean civilization collapsed around 1200 BCE, part of that same Bronze Age catastrophe that toppled so many kingdoms, Linear B vanished with it. Completely. The scribes who had maintained the system, trained over years in its complex syllabic symbols, simply disappeared from history. And when Greek civilization eventually re-emerged centuries later, it used an entirely different writing system, the alphabet inherited from the Phoenicians. This is unusual. Writing systems rarely disappear so completely. Normally, knowledge is transmitted, adapted, preserved in some form. What happened to the scribes? Were they killed when the palaces burned? Did they survive but find no one left to write for? Did their knowledge die with them, one generation at a time, until it was simply gone? Europe forgot how to read and write, and then had to learn all over again. The fate of the Etruscan civilization. Before Rome became Rome, there were the Etruscans. They dominated central Italy for centuries, building sophisticated cities, creating remarkable art, developing a written language, and influencing Roman culture so profoundly that many of Rome's religious practices, architectural forms, and political institutions trace directly back to Etruscan origins. The Romans themselves acknowledged this debt, even as they gradually absorbed Etruscan territory and, eventually, Etruscan identity. By the 1st century BCE, The Etruscans had essentially ceased to exist as a distinct people. Not through massacre or plague, but through a slow process of cultural absorption, their cities becoming Roman cities, their aristocracy intermarrying with Roman families, their language giving way to Latin. And yet mysteries remain. The Etruscan language, while it can be partially read, the alphabet was borrowed from Greek, is still not fully understood. It is a language isolate, unrelated to any other known language family, which means there is no Rosetta Stone, no related tongue that can help unlock its full meaning. Thousands of Etruscan inscriptions exist. Most are short. Longer texts that might have revealed Etruscan history, mythology, and thought in depth have not survived. A civilization that shaped the world's most powerful empire left behind a language no one can fully read. The mystery of the Sabaeans. In the ancient world, the land known as Saba, or Sheba, was legendary for its wealth. Biblical accounts describe the Queen of Sheba traveling to meet King Solomon, bearing gifts of gold and spices and precious stones. Ancient sources from the Romans to the Greeks spoke of a civilization in southern Arabia so rich in frankincense and myrrh that their trade routes shaped the economy of the ancient world. The Sabaeans were real. Archaeology has confirmed the existence of a sophisticated civilization in what is now Yemen, flourishing from roughly the 10th century BCE onward. They built monumental temples and irrigation systems, created a written language, and controlled trade routes that connected Arabia to Africa, India, and the Mediterranean. But much about them remains deeply unclear. The full extent of their political organization is uncertain. Their religious practices are only partially understood. The relationship between the various Sabaean texts and inscriptions and the broader narratives attached to their name in the Bible and other ancient sources is still a matter of scholarly debate. And the Queen of Sheba herself, was she a historical figure? If so, who was she really? The Ethiopian tradition claims her as a founding ancestor. The Yemeni tradition claims her too. Islamic, Jewish, and Christian traditions all incorporate her in different ways. A real civilization. A legendary queen. And the space between history and myth, still unresolved. The Indus Valley Script. Between roughly 2600 and 1900 BCE, one of the largest civilizations in the ancient world flourished in the river valleys of what is now Pakistan and northwestern India. The Indus Valley Civilization, also known as the Harappan Civilization, was extraordinary by any measure. At its height, it may have had a population of over 5 million people. Its cities were planned with remarkable sophistication, straight streets laid out on a grid, houses with indoor plumbing and drainage systems that would not be seen again in the region for thousands of years, and standardized weights and measures that suggest a complex and well-organized economy. And they had writing. Over 4,000 artifacts bearing the Indus script have been found, engraved on small seals, on tablets, on pottery. The symbols are clear and deliberate. They were obviously meaningful. But no one has ever deciphered them. Unlike Egyptian hieroglyphics or Mesopotamian cuneiform, there is no bilingual text, no ancient Rosetta Stone, that provides a bridge between the Indus script and any language we already know. The underlying language itself is unknown. Attempts at decipherment using computational analysis have produced competing theories but no consensus. An entire civilization's written record sits before us, and we cannot read a single word of it. Their thoughts, their laws, their stories, sealed behind symbols that have refused, for over a century of scholarly effort, to give up their meaning. The Lost City of Helike. In the winter of 373 BCE, on the northern coast of the Peloponnese in ancient Greece, a city disappeared beneath the sea in a single night. Helike was a prosperous and important city, a founding member of the Achaean League, a center of trade, and home to a famous sanctuary of the god Poseidon. Ancient writers described it as wealthy and well-populated, a place of some significance in the Greek world. Then, one night, an earthquake struck. A massive tsunami followed. By morning, Helike was gone, swallowed entirely by the sea, along with every person in it. Ancient sources record that even the sacred bronze statue of Poseidon was submerged, a cruel irony given that Poseidon was the god of both the sea and earthquakes. For centuries afterward, ancient travelers reported being able to see the ruins of the city beneath the shallow water, walls, streets, the shapes of submerged buildings, visible from boats on calm days. It became something of an ancient wonder, a real sunken city that people could point to and marvel at. And then the silt came. Centuries of sediment buried the ruins, and Helike was lost even to those who might have dived to find it. In the 1990s, archaeologists resumed searching and eventually located what they believed to be the site, buried under several meters of coastal sediment. Excavations have been ongoing, slowly uncovering what the earth reclaimed. Some historians believe Helike may have been one of the inspirations for the legend of Atlantis, recorded by Plato just a few decades after the city's destruction. A real city, a real catastrophe, and a legend that may have grown from its memory. The Nazca Lines. In the dry coastal desert of southern Peru, scratched into the pale earth of a high plateau, there are drawings. Hundreds of them. Lines that stretch for kilometers in perfectly straight trajectories across the landscape. Geometric shapes, trapezoids, spirals, rectangles, vast enough to cover entire fields. And figures, a hummingbird with a wingspan of nearly 100 meters. A condor. A spider. A monkey. A figure some have called the astronaut, arms raised toward the sky. The Nazca Lines were created by the Nazca people, who lived in this region from roughly 500 BCE to 500 CE. They made the lines by removing the reddish-brown iron oxide-coated pebbles from the surface to reveal the lighter yellowish-gray ground beneath. The work is precise. The lines are remarkably straight, even over long distances, suggesting careful planning and execution. But why? The most enduring question about the Nazca Lines is their purpose. The figures are so large that they are only fully visible from the air, which has led to some fanciful theories over the years. But the Nazca people did not have aircraft, and those theories have no serious academic support. More credible explanations suggest the lines may have been connected to water rituals. The desert here is one of the driest places on Earth, and water would have been precious and sacred. Some lines appear to point toward underground water sources. Others may have been paths used in ceremonial processions. Recent research using satellite imagery has continued to reveal new figures, some barely visible, scattered across a wider area than previously mapped. The desert keeps its patterns, drawn in patient silence, waiting for an explanation that fully satisfies. The origin of the Olmec colossal heads. In the humid lowlands of what is now the Mexican states of Veracruz and Tabasco, a civilization flourished over 3,000 years ago that most people have never heard of. The Olmecs are often called the mother culture of Mesoamerica, the civilization that preceded and in many ways laid the foundation for the Aztecs, the Maya, and all the other great cultures of ancient Mexico and Central America. They built large ceremonial centers, developed early writing and calendar systems, and created art of striking sophistication. But their most famous legacy is a series of enormous stone heads. 17 colossal heads have been discovered so far, each carved from a single massive basalt boulder. The largest stand nearly 3.5 meters tall and weigh over 40 tons. Each depicts a human face wearing a distinctive helmet-like headdress, with broad features, flat noses, and thick lips. They are almost certainly portraits of specific rulers or important individuals. But everything else about them is uncertain. The basalt used to carve them came from the Tuxtla Mountains, over 100 kilometers away, meaning the boulders had to be transported enormous distances through jungle and across rivers, without the wheel and without pack animals. How this was accomplished remains unclear. And the faces themselves have attracted decades of debate. Some researchers have noted that the facial features appear to resemble people of African descent, which has fueled theories of pre-Columbian contact between Africa and the Americas. The mainstream archaeological view holds that this resemblance is coincidental, and that the heads depict indigenous Mesoamerican individuals. The heads rest in museums and jungle clearings, their expressions unreadable, watching the centuries pass. The builder of Derinkuyu underground city. In 1963, in the Cappadocia region of central Turkey, a man doing renovations on his home knocked down a wall and discovered a hidden room. Behind that room was a tunnel. And that tunnel led to one of the most astonishing underground structures ever found. Derinkuyu is an ancient underground city carved entirely out of volcanic rock, descending approximately 18 stories below the surface of the earth. It has ventilation shafts, wells, stables, wineries, churches, schools, and storage rooms. It could shelter tens of thousands of people, along with their livestock, for extended periods. Every entrance could be sealed from the inside with enormous circular stone doors, rolled into place like giant wheels, impassable from without. Who built it? The honest answer is, we don't know. The city was certainly used and expanded by early Christians in the Byzantine period, seeking refuge from persecution. But the original construction is believed to be much older, possibly dating back to the Phrygians in the 1st millennium BCE, or even earlier. Some researchers have proposed Hittite origins. The oldest levels of the city have not been definitively dated. Derinkuyu is not the only such city in Cappadocia. Over 200 underground dwellings and tunnels have been found in the region, some of them connected by tunnels stretching for kilometers. An entire underground world, hidden beneath the surface of the earth, begun by people whose names we do not know. The builder of Sacsayhuaman Fortress. On a hillside above the ancient Inca capital of Cusco in Peru, there is a wall. It is not an ordinary wall. The stones that form it are enormous, some weighing over 300 tons, making them among the largest construction blocks used anywhere in the ancient world. They are not uniform in shape. Each stone is irregular, with many faces and angles. And yet they fit together with breathtaking precision, their irregular surfaces interlocking so perfectly that in many places a piece of paper cannot be slid between them. This is Sacsayhuaman, a ceremonial complex and fortress built by the Inca civilization, begun in the 15th century CE. Spanish chronicles written after the conquest describe thousands of workers laboring on the site over decades. But the how of it remains profoundly puzzling. The stone was quarried from sites several kilometers away, moved across rugged Andean terrain without the wheel, without steel tools, and without draft animals capable of pulling such immense weights. The precision of the fitting, achieved in stone, not wood or metal, which can be adjusted, required extraordinary skill and planning. Modern engineers and architects who have studied Sacsayhuaman have been unable to reach consensus on the exact methods used. Experimental reconstructions have demonstrated that large stones can be moved with ropes, ramps, and human labor, but nothing has fully explained the perfection of the fitting. The Inca had no written language. Their knowledge was carried in memory, in oral tradition, in the knotted string records called quipus. And when the Spanish conquest shattered their civilization, much of that knowledge was lost. The stones remain, fitted so closely they might have grown together naturally, a puzzle made of mountains. The vanishing of the Anasazi. In the high desert plateau where the states of Colorado, Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico meet, a region the Navajo people would later call Dineta, there was once a civilization of remarkable achievement. The ancestral Pueblones, sometimes called by their Navajo name Anasazi, meaning ancient ones or ancient enemies, built multi-story stone cities into cliffsides and canyon walls. Their architecture at places like Cliff Palace in Mesa Verde and Pueblo Bonito in Chaco Canyon was sophisticated, carefully oriented to astronomical alignments, and clearly the product of a complex and organized society. And then, in the late 13th century, they left. Within a few generations, the great cliff dwellings and canyon settlements were abandoned. The people dispersed, moving south and east to form the Pueblo communities of the Rio Grande Valley and other areas, where their descendants live today. The reasons for the abandonment have been debated for well over a century. A prolonged and severe drought in the late 1200s almost certainly played a role. Tree ring records showed decades of dramatically reduced rainfall. Social upheaval and intercommunity conflict, evidenced by archaeological signs of violence, may also have been factors. But something important to understand is that from the perspective of the Pueblo peoples themselves, this was not a disappearance, it was a migration. Their descendants are here, and they have oral traditions that speak to this period of movement and change. The mystery is not that the people vanished. The mystery is the full story of why they chose to leave, and what those final years in the cliff cities were like. Empty rooms, doorways open to the desert wind, still holding that question. The disappearance of Cleopatra's tomb. Cleopatra VII, the last ruler of an independent Egypt, the final monarch of the Ptolemaic dynasty, died in 30 BCE, shortly after the suicide of her partner Mark Antony and the conquest of Egypt by the Roman general Octavian. Ancient sources tell us she was buried alongside Mark Antony in a tomb she had prepared in advance, a grand monument somewhere in or near Alexandria, the great city she had ruled. That tomb has never been found. Alexandria itself presents enormous archaeological challenges. Much of the ancient city now lies underwater, submerged by millennia of coastal subsidence and seismic activity. Other portions are buried beneath the modern city, inaccessible without massive disruption. Over the centuries, numerous expeditions have searched for Cleopatra's resting place. In 2010, archaeologist Kathleen Martinez announced the discovery of a promising site at Taposiris Magna, a temple complex southwest of Alexandria, where excavations have uncovered artifacts and tunnels and signs of significant ancient activity. The tomb has not yet been confirmed. Excavations continue. One of the most famous individuals in all of human history, a woman who shaped the course of the ancient world, who was celebrated, mythologized, painted, and written about for 2,000 years, rests somewhere unknown, in a place that has kept its secret through every empire that has risen and fallen above it. The fate of Harold Godwinson's body. On the 14th of October, 1066, two armies met on a hillside in southern England. On one side stood Harold Godwinson, King of England, defending his crown against an invader. On the other stood William, Duke of Normandy, who believed the English throne was rightfully his. By the end of the day, Harold was dead, his army broken, and England's history permanently altered. The Norman conquest had begun. The famous Bayeux tapestry depicts Harold's death, though even that image is disputed, with scholars disagreeing about which figure in the embroidery actually represents him in his final moment. But what happened to Harold's body afterward is genuinely unknown. Contemporary sources conflict. One account says William, in an act of contempt, had Harold buried on the beach near the battlefield, to symbolically guard the shore he had failed to defend. Another tradition holds that Harold was eventually interred at Waltham Abbey in Essex, a church he himself had founded and endowed. The abbey maintained this claim for centuries, and a memorial marker stands there today. No burial site has ever been confirmed. No remains have been definitively identified as Harold's. The last Anglo-Saxon king of England, whose death in a single afternoon changed the course of a nation, has no verified resting place. He is everywhere and nowhere, a king buried in the argument over where he lies. Lost knowledge and forbidden texts. We leave the ruins of lost civilizations behind now, and we move into something perhaps even more haunting, the knowledge those civilizations gathered, recorded, and then lost. Books that burned. Scripts that no one can read. Objects whose purpose has been debated for 1,000 years. Maps that seem to show things they should not be able to show. Knowledge is fragile. It lives inside minds, and minds are mortal. It lives inside texts, and texts can burn. It lives inside traditions, and traditions can be broken. The disappearance of the Library of Alexandria's catalogue. The Library of Alexandria is perhaps the most famous library in history, and its destruction one of the most lamented losses in the history of human thought. At its height, the library is believed to have held somewhere between 40,000 and perhaps 700,000 scrolls, depending on which ancient account you choose to trust. It was a living repository of the accumulated knowledge of the ancient world, philosophy, mathematics, medicine, astronomy, poetry, history, geography, drawn from every culture the Greeks had come into contact with. The library did not die in a single dramatic fire, as popular imagination often suggests. It declined slowly over centuries, diminished by funding cuts, political upheaval, and the gradual shift of intellectual life to other centers. Various fires and destructions contributed over time. By late antiquity, it was gone. But here is the particular mystery: the catalogue. A scholar named Callimachus compiled a monumental catalogue of the library's holdings, a document called the Pinakes, meaning tablets, which ran to an estimated 120 scrolls. It was essentially an annotated bibliography of ancient Greek literature, a record of what existed and where it came from. The Pinakes is lost. Only fragments survive, quoted in later sources. Which means we do not know exactly what the library contained. We know about the works that survived because people copied them and passed them forward. But for every text we have, there may have been dozens we do not, and we cannot even compile a reliable list of what we are missing. We don't know what we don't know. The catalogue of the unknown was itself lost. A silence that contains an entire library. The Copper Scroll Treasure. In 1952, in a cave near the Dead Sea in what is now Jordan, archaeologists discovered something unlike any of the other Dead Sea Scrolls. Most of the Dead Sea Scrolls were written on parchment or papyrus, organic materials, fragile and ancient. But this scroll was made of copper, and it had been rolled up and left in the cave for nearly 2,000 years. When researchers finally managed to cut it open and read it, they found something extraordinary: a list. A very specific, detailed list of locations, caves, ruins, cisterns, courtyards, each accompanied by a quantity of treasure. Gold, silver, precious vessels. Enormous amounts, in total running to dozens of tons of precious metal. The Copper Scroll appears to be a treasure map. Scholars have debated its nature ever since. Some believe it records the actual hidden treasures of the Jerusalem Temple, buried before the Roman destruction of the city in 70 CE. Others argue the amounts listed are so fantastically large as to be symbolic or legendary rather than literal. The locations described are frustratingly vague. Many reference landmarks that no longer exist or cannot be identified with certainty in the modern landscape. Numerous expeditions have gone looking. Nothing has ever been found. A map made of metal, inscribed with quantities of gold, pointing toward places no one can find. Either the greatest undiscovered treasure in history, or an ancient mystery whose literal meaning we have long since lost. The Lost Ark of the Covenant. According to the Hebrew Bible, the Ark of the Covenant was a chest of acacia wood, overlaid with gold, constructed at the direction of God and carried by the Israelites through the wilderness. It was said to contain the stone tablets of the Ten Commandments. It was described as the dwelling place of the divine presence. It was carried into battle. It was installed in the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem, in the innermost sanctuary, a room so sacred that only the high priest could enter it, and only once a year. And then, sometime around the 6th century BCE, it vanished from the historical record. The Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the first temple in 586 BCE. The Bible lists many items taken as spoils, but the ark is not among them. Nor is it mentioned as destroyed. It simply stops appearing in the narrative, as though it quietly stepped out of history. Where did it go? Theories have circulated for millennia. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church claims to possess the ark, kept in a chapel in the city of Aksum, tended by a single monk whose sole duty is its guardianship. No outside observer has ever been permitted to verify this claim. Other theories suggest the ark was hidden before the Babylonian invasion, perhaps in a cave, perhaps somewhere beneath Jerusalem itself. Archaeological excavations under the Temple Mount are essentially impossible for political and religious reasons, and likely will remain so for the foreseeable future. The most sacred object in the ancient Israelite tradition stepped quietly out of history and has never stepped back in. The location of the Holy Lance. According to the Gospel of John, as Jesus hung on the cross, a Roman soldier pierced his side with a spear to confirm that he was dead. That spear, known as the Holy Lance, the Spear of Destiny, or the Lance of Longinus, became one of the most sought-after relics in Christian history. Possession of it was believed to confer divine protection and even the power to conquer. The problem is that at least 4 different objects in different parts of the world have been claimed as the authentic Holy Lance at various points in history. There is a lance in the Vatican, presented to Pope Innocent VIII in 1492 by the Ottoman Sultan. There is one in Vienna, kept in the imperial treasury, which was venerated by Holy Roman emperors and, notoriously, reportedly sought by Adolf Hitler as part of his obsession with occult objects of power. There is one in Krakow, Poland, and one in Ekmiadzin, Armenia. Scientific analysis of the Vienna lance has shown it dates to around the 7th century CE, which would make it far too recent to be the actual spear from the crucifixion. Yet it continues to be venerated. Whether any of these objects is authentic, whether the original relic still exists somewhere, or whether it was lost centuries ago, is entirely unknown. For spears. One story. No certain answer. The location of the Holy Lance. According to the Gospel of John, as Jesus hung on the cross, a Roman soldier pierced his side with a spear to confirm that he was dead. That spear, known as the Holy Lance, the Spear of Destiny, or the Lance of Longinus, became one of the most sought-after relics in Christian history. Possession of it was believed to confer divine protection and even the power to conquer. The problem is that at least 4 different objects in different parts of the world have been claimed as the authentic Holy Lance at various points in history. There is a lance in the Vatican, presented to Pope Innocent VIII in 1492 by the Ottoman Sultan. There is one in Vienna, kept in the imperial treasury, which was venerated by Holy Roman emperors and, notoriously, reportedly sought by Adolf Hitler as part of his obsession with occult objects of power. There is one in Krakow, Poland, and one in Ekmiadzin, Armenia. Scientific analysis of the Vienna lance has shown it dates to around the 7th century CE, which would make it far too recent to be the actual spear from the crucifixion. Yet it continues to be venerated. Whether any of these objects is authentic, whether the original relic still exists somewhere, or whether it was lost centuries ago, is entirely unknown. For spears. One story. No certain answer. The Phaistos disc. In 1908, in the ruins of a Minoan palace at Phaistos on the island of Crete, an Italian archaeologist named Luigi Pernia found something that has never been satisfactorily explained. It was a clay disc, roughly 15 centimeters in diameter, fired hard in ancient times. On both of its faces, arranged in a spiral pattern from the outside edge toward the center, were symbols, stamped into the clay before firing using what appear to have been small individual stamps or seals, each one pressed individually into the soft clay. There are 241 symbols in total, representing 45 distinct signs. They depict recognizable things: a walking figure, a head with a feathered headdress, a fish, a bird, a beehive, a hand, a shield. The disc dates to approximately 1700 BCE. It is entirely unique. No other object like it has ever been found. No similar script appears anywhere else in the archaeological record of Crete or the wider Bronze Age Mediterranean. It has never been deciphered. Dozens of proposed decipherments have been put forward over the past century, ranging from a prayer to a hymn to an astronomical calendar to a board game. None has achieved scholarly acceptance, primarily because with only 241 symbols, there is simply not enough text to verify any proposed interpretation. One disc. One inscription. No key. It sits in the Heraklion Archaeological Museum in Crete, behind glass, sealed in its own private language. The meaning of the Phaistos disc's reverse side. The Phaistos disc has two sides, and the relationship between them deepens the mystery rather than resolving it. Side A and Side B both contain spiraling sequences of stamped symbols, and while they share the same set of 45 signs, the arrangements and sequences differ. This suggests the two sides are not simply a continuation of the same text but may represent two distinct passages, two distinct messages, or two halves of a structured whole. Perhaps a question and answer, perhaps two verses of a hymn, perhaps something else entirely. Some researchers have proposed that the direction of reading may differ between the two sides. Others have noted that Side A contains more symbols than Side B, which may indicate a hierarchy or an asymmetric structure. A small number of scholars have questioned whether the disc is genuinely ancient at all, suggesting it might be a modern forgery. This view is a minority position and is not widely accepted, but it adds another layer of uncertainty to an already deeply puzzling object. The disc was found alone, in a small room associated with archive storage, alongside other artifacts that were genuinely Minoan. There is no reason to doubt its authenticity, and every reason to accept that someone, 3,700 years ago, pressed these symbols into wet clay with careful, deliberate hands. They made it to be read. And we have not yet learned how. The Rongorongo script. Easter Island, Rapa Nui, is one of the most remote inhabited places on Earth, a tiny volcanic triangle of land in the middle of the South Pacific, over 3,000 kilometers from the nearest continental coastline. It is famous for its moai, the enormous stone statues that stand along its shores, their backs to the sea, watching over the land they were carved to protect. But Easter Island has another mystery, less famous and in some ways more haunting. When European missionaries arrived on the island in the 19th century, they found wooden tablets covered in intricate carved symbols, rows of figures, geometric shapes, creatures both real and fantastical, all arranged in careful sequences that clearly constituted a writing system. The islanders called it rongorongo, meaning chanting or recitation. Unfortunately, by the time serious scholarly attention was turned to the tablets, the people who could read them were nearly all gone. A smallpox epidemic, slave raids that had carried away much of the island's population, including virtually all of its educated and priestly class, and the disruptions of missionary conversion had together destroyed the living tradition of rongorongo reading within a generation. 27 surviving tablets are scattered across museums around the world. The script has never been deciphered. A writing system on one of Earth's most isolated islands, created independently by a people who had no contact with literate civilizations, and silenced before the world could learn to hear it. The Rongorongo script. Easter Island, Rapa Nui, is one of the most remote inhabited places on Earth, a tiny volcanic triangle of land in the middle of the South Pacific, over 3,000 kilometers from the nearest continental coastline. It is famous for its moai, the enormous stone statues that stand along its shores, their backs to the sea, watching over the land they were carved to protect. But Easter Island has another mystery, less famous and in some ways more haunting. When European missionaries arrived on the island in the 19th century, they found wooden tablets covered in intricate carved symbols, rows of figures, geometric shapes, creatures both real and fantastical, all arranged in careful sequences that clearly constituted a writing system. The islanders called it rongorongo, meaning chanting or recitation. Unfortunately, by the time serious scholarly attention was turned to the tablets, the people who could read them were nearly all gone. A smallpox epidemic, slave raids that had carried away much of the island's population, including virtually all of its educated and priestly class, and the disruptions of missionary conversion had together destroyed the living tradition of rongorongo reading within a generation. 27 surviving tablets are scattered across museums around the world. The script has never been deciphered. A writing system on one of Earth's most isolated islands, created independently by a people who had no contact with literate civilizations, and silenced before the world could learn to hear it. The meaning of the Rongorongo Koru tablet. Among the 27 surviving Rongorongo tablets, one stands out for particular scholarly attention, a tablet sometimes called the Koru, or the Small Santiago tablet. It is one of the more complete surviving examples, and it contains a long, uninterrupted sequence of glyphs that researchers believe may represent a single sustained composition rather than a collection of shorter passages. The glyphs on the Koru tablet include repeating motifs. Certain symbols appear in regular patterns, suggesting structural elements like refrains in a song or recurring phrases in a ritual chant. This has led some researchers to propose that the tablet may record a ceremonial text, perhaps used in religious observances or oral performances. Oral testimony collected from the last surviving people with any knowledge of rongorongo in the 19th century suggested the texts were chanted aloud during ceremonies, that the tablets were not silent records but scores for performance, aids to memory for priests and chanters who already knew the content. If that is true, then the tablets are less like books and more like musical notation, meaningful only in combination with a living tradition of performance that no longer exists. The Koru tablet sits in a museum in Santiago, Chile, its glyphs carved with care and purpose, waiting for a voice that knows the melody. The Voynich Manuscript. In 1912, a rare book dealer named Wilfrid Voynich purchased a strange manuscript from a collection at a Jesuit college in Italy. The manuscript was old. Carbon dating has since placed its creation in the early 15th century, around 1404 to 1438 CE. It was written on vellum, in a careful, flowing hand, filling over 200 pages. It was illustrated with hundreds of detailed drawings, strange plants that don't match any known species, astronomical diagrams showing stars and circular arrangements, naked human figures bathing in pools connected by elaborate tube systems, and what appear to be pharmaceutical or herbal preparations. Every word of the text is written in an unknown script, in an unknown language, that no one has ever been able to decipher. The Voynich Manuscript has been studied by professional cryptographers, linguists, computer scientists, and amateur enthusiasts for over a century. It was examined by teams that cracked Nazi codes during World War II. It has been subjected to statistical analysis, computational modeling, and artificial intelligence. Dozens of proposed decipherments have been put forward and subsequently rejected. Statistical analysis has shown that the text has properties consistent with a natural language. It is not simply random symbols. The letter frequencies, word lengths, and repetition patterns all suggest something structured and meaningful. Yet no one can read it. Is it an encrypted text in a known language? An invented language? A constructed script designed to look meaningful while conveying nothing? An elaborate hoax? Or something genuinely linguistic that we simply lack the key to unlock? It sits in the Voynich Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Yale University, digitized and freely available for anyone to study, equally mysterious to everyone who looks. The Voynich Manuscript's author. Since the manuscript cannot be read, its author is entirely unknown. But that has not stopped people from theorizing. An early and persistent theory attributed the manuscript to Roger Bacon, the 13th century English friar and natural philosopher who was known for his interest in encryption and secret knowledge. This theory is now largely discredited. The carbon dating places the manuscript over a century after Bacon's death. Other candidates have included the Renaissance polymath John Dee and his associate Edward Kelly, who were known to have developed an invented angelic language called Enochian. But no connection has ever been firmly established. A letter accompanying the manuscript when it changed hands in the late 16th century claimed it had once been purchased by Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II for a large sum. Rudolph was a known collector of curiosities and occult materials. But even this provenance cannot be independently verified. Some researchers have proposed the manuscript is a hoax created to sell to credulous collectors, an elaborate, internally consistent fake designed to look important without actually saying anything. If so, it is the most sophisticated and sustained hoax in the history of manuscripts. Others maintain that the statistical properties of the text are simply too consistent with real language for it to be meaningless. Whoever wrote it sat down with a quill and carefully covered hundreds of pages in an unknown hand. They drew strange plants and astronomical figures and bathing women. And then they, and the meaning of what they had written, disappeared entirely. The Antikythera mechanism. In the year 1900, sponge divers working off the coast of the Greek island of Antikythera found a shipwreck on the seafloor, about 50 meters down. Among the treasures they recovered, marble statues, bronze figures, glassware, jewelry, was a lump of corroded bronze that no one quite knew what to make of. It was set aside. It was not until 1902 that an archaeologist examining the corroded fragments noticed something astonishing inside: gears. Tiny, precise, interlocking bronze gears, of a complexity that had no business existing in an object from roughly 100 BCE. What had been recovered was a mechanical computer. The Antikythera mechanism, as it came to be known, was a hand-powered device capable of calculating and displaying astronomical information, the positions of the Sun and Moon in the zodiac, the phases of the Moon, the timing of solar and lunar eclipses, and possibly the positions of the 5 known planets. It even accounted for the irregular orbit of the Moon. Nothing remotely as mechanically sophisticated as the Antikythera mechanism appears in the archaeological record for over 1,000 years after it was made. It is as though a laptop was found in a medieval chest. Modern X-ray and CT scanning has revealed layers of detail in the mechanism that continue to surprise researchers. As recently as 2021, a team announced a new reconstruction that accounts for more of its features than any previous model. Who made it? How was the knowledge to build it acquired? And why, after it was made, was nothing like it made again for 1,000 years? A question assembled from gears, resting on the seafloor for 2,000 years. The secret of the Antikythera shipwreck's cargo. The Antikythera mechanism was not traveling alone. The ship that sank off Antikythera around 70 to 60 BCE was carrying what appears to have been an extraordinarily valuable and eclectic cargo: bronze and marble statues of gods, athletes, and horses, fine glassware, silver and gold coins, furniture fittings, and the mechanism itself. The statues alone are remarkable. Among them were what appear to be original Greek bronzes of the highest quality, the kind of masterworks that Roman collectors would have paid enormous sums to acquire. Most ancient Greek bronzes were melted down long ago. Bronze was too valuable to leave lying around. The Antikythera wreck preserved several that would otherwise have been lost. But where was the ship going? Who owned the cargo? Was the Antikythera mechanism part of a private collection, or was it in active use aboard the ship for navigation? Was it being shipped as a curiosity, a diplomatic gift, a piece of scientific equipment, or simply a valuable object for sale? Recent expeditions to the wreck site, using modern underwater archaeology technology, have continued to find new artifacts, including, in 2017, what appears to be a human skeleton, raising the possibility of recovering ancient DNA from the ship's crew or passengers. The wreck is still giving up its secrets, one careful excavation season at a time. A ship sailing through ancient waters, loaded with wonders, bound somewhere we will never know. The Map of the King of Zhou. In ancient Chinese tradition, there are references to a great map, a map of the world as known to the Zhou dynasty, which ruled China from roughly 1046 to 256 BCE. This map, sometimes called the Yugong map or associated with the legendary cartographic traditions of ancient China, is referenced in classical texts as a comprehensive geographical survey of the known world, detailing rivers, mountains, regions, and the territories of the realm. The original map, if it existed as a single physical document, has never been found. China's cartographic tradition is ancient and sophisticated, and texts describing geographical knowledge from the Zhou period do survive. But the physical maps themselves, made on perishable materials in an era before paper, have largely not. What makes this mystery particularly intriguing is the question of what such a map might have shown, how far Chinese geographical knowledge extended in the first millennium BCE, how trade routes and tribute relationships shaped the understanding of the world's layout, and how cosmological and practical concerns were balanced in the way the world was drawn. Maps are never just geography. They are records of what a civilization believed the world to be, what it considered important, and how it placed itself at the center of everything it knew. A map that may have shown a world we can no longer see through ancient eyes. The Piri Reis Map. In 1929, in the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, a map was discovered during a renovation. It had been drawn in 1513 by an Ottoman admiral named Piri Reis, and it depicted the coastlines of Europe, Africa, and the Americas with remarkable accuracy, particularly notable given that it was drawn only 2 decades after Columbus's first voyage to the New World. But it was the southern portion of the map that attracted the most extraordinary attention. Below South America, The map shows a landmass that some researchers have interpreted as an accurate depiction of Antarctica, a continent that was not officially discovered until 1820, more than 300 years after Piri Reis drew his map. Moreover, some have argued that the coastline shown matches the subice topography of Antarctica, the shape of the land beneath the ice sheet, which was not mapped until the 20th century. If true, this would be inexplicable. It would imply access to geographical information of unknown origin. The mainstream scholarly view is more cautious. Most cartographic historians believe the southern landmass represents a speculative southern continent, a feature that appeared on many maps of the era based on the ancient Greek theoretical assumption that a large southern landmass must exist to balance the known northern continents. Piri Reis himself noted in annotations that he drew on older source maps, some of which he attributed to the time of Alexander the Great. What those sources were, and what they showed, is unknown. A map drawn 5 centuries ago, still asking questions about where its knowledge came from. The Sabaoth coin of Phaistos. Among the many artifacts associated with the ancient Minoan and later Cretan civilizations, a small number of coins and tokens bear inscriptions and symbols that have resisted definitive interpretation. The island of Crete has a remarkably layered archaeological record: Minoan, Mycenaean, Archaic Greek, Classical, Hellenistic, Roman, Byzantine, each era leaving traces that sometimes intermingle and overlap in confusing ways. Certain artifacts from this record, particularly from the Phaistos region, bear symbols or inscriptions that appear to blend influences in ways that are not straightforwardly explainable, drawing on symbol sets from multiple eras, or bearing marks whose function as currency, religious tokens, or administrative records cannot be cleanly determined. The difficulty with many such small artifacts is one of context. When an object is found without clear stratigraphic information, without clear association with other dated materials, its meaning becomes multiply ambiguous. What era does it belong to? What was it used for? What do the marks on its surface signify? Small objects from ancient hands, coins, tokens, seals, amulets, carry compressed worlds of meaning that we are often unable to fully unpack. Crete holds many such quiet puzzles, buried in its soil and locked in its museums, waiting for a context that would make everything clear. The location of the Ambrosian Codex's missing pages. The Ambrosiana Library in Milan, founded in the early 17th century, holds one of the great manuscript collections in the world, including the Codex Atlanticus, a monumental collection of drawings and writings by Leonardo da Vinci. But among the Ambrosiana's holdings is another, lesser-known mystery: manuscripts and codices that are incomplete, bearing clear evidence that pages, sometimes many pages, have been removed at some point in their history. The history of manuscript collections is a history of dispersal, theft, sale, and loss. Pages were removed for sale to private collectors. Illuminated pages were cut out for their decorative value. Texts were censored by removing passages deemed heretical or dangerous. When Napoleon's forces occupied Milan in 1796, they confiscated a significant portion of the Ambrosiana's collection and transported it to Paris. Some materials were eventually returned after Napoleon's defeat. Others were not, or were returned incomplete. The missing pages of certain Ambrosian codices have been traced in some cases to collections in Paris, London, and elsewhere around the world, scattered like seeds by centuries of displacement. Other pages simply cannot be accounted for. They may exist in private collections, unrecognized for what they are. They may have been destroyed. They may surface someday in an auction catalogue or a library storage room, a piece of a puzzle that the rest of its manuscript has been missing for centuries. Books scattered across the world, looking for their missing parts. Still incomplete. Still waiting. Empires, wars and secret orders. We move now into the age of empires, the great sprawling powers that rose from conquest and organization and sheer force of will, that shaped the world in their image, and that left behind mysteries as large as the armies they commanded. Legions that marched into the unknown and never came back. Treasures that vanished when the empires that created them fell. Secret orders that operated in the shadows of history, leaving traces that are still debated today. The world of power is full of gaps. Things that were deliberately hidden. Things that were lost in the chaos of collapse. Things that simply walked out of history and kept walking. The fate of the Ninth Legion. The Ninth Legion, Legio IX Hispana, was one of the most storied units in the Roman army. It had served in the conquest of Britain under the Emperor Claudius in 43 CE, participated in crushing the revolt of Boudicca in 60 CE, and was stationed for decades in the north of England at the fortress city of Eboracum, the place we now call York. And then, sometime in the early 2nd century CE, it simply disappears from the Roman military record. No discharge. No transfer. No record of disbandment. The Ninth Legion, 5,000 soldiers, is attested in Britain, and then it is not. The most dramatic theory, popularized in the 20th century and embedded deeply in popular imagination through novels and films, is that the Ninth marched north into Scotland to deal with the unconquered tribes of Caledonia, and was annihilated there, somewhere beyond Hadrian's Wall, in the mist and heather, overwhelmed by warriors who left no record of the encounter. The historical reality may be somewhat less romantic. Some scholars have argued that stamp tiles and other evidence suggest the Ninth was transferred out of Britain to the continent or to the Middle East, and may have been destroyed in a different campaign entirely, perhaps in the Bar Kokhba revolt in Judea around 132 CE, or in a campaign against Parthia. The evidence is fragmentary and contested. No mass grave, no battle site, no final inscription has been found to close the case. 5,000 soldiers. Gone. The fog of northern Britain still holds whatever secret it knows. The fate of the lost Legion 9 in Parthia. The fate of the Ninth Legion is not an isolated Roman mystery. The empire's eastern frontier produced its own haunting disappearance. In 53 BCE, the Roman general Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome, and one-third of the ruling First Triumvirate alongside Caesar and Pompey, led an army of roughly 40,000 men into the territory of Parthia, in what is now Iraq and Iran. It was a disaster of the first order. At the Battle of Carrhae, the Parthian cavalry and horse archers destroyed the Roman force with tactics Rome had never encountered at that scale. Crassus himself was killed. Tens of thousands of soldiers were killed or captured. Some of those captured were marched deep into Parthian territory, possibly as far as the eastern edge of the empire, into Central Asia. And here the story takes a strange turn. A Chinese chronicle from the Han Dynasty describes a settlement of unusual soldiers encountered during military operations in Central Asia around 36 BCE. Soldiers who reportedly fought in a distinctive formation described as resembling fish scales, which some historians have identified as the Roman testudo, or tortoise formation. Could survivors of the Carrhae disaster have drifted east across Persia and Central Asia over the following decades, eventually reaching the edges of the Chinese sphere? It is an almost impossible journey. But the gap in Roman records on one side, and the puzzling Chinese description on the other, have kept the theory alive. Soldiers of Rome, lost somewhere between two empires that never officially knew each other existed. The lost Roman legion in China. The thread from the previous mystery leads us to an even more extraordinary possibility. A small town in the Gansu province of northwestern China, called Lichian, or Gelashai, has been the subject of remarkable speculation since the 20th century. Local residents have traditionally included a higher-than-usual proportion of people with light eyes, light hair, and unusually tall stature, physical characteristics that diverge from the regional norm. The town's ancient name, Lichian, is believed to be a Chinese phonetic rendering of the word legion, specifically Roman legion. A theory developed by Oxford historian Homer Dubbs in the 1950s proposed that Roman prisoners captured at Kahi were sold east, served in Parthian armies, were captured again by Han Chinese forces, and eventually settled in northwestern China, founding or contributing to the community at Lichian. DNA testing of residents of Gelashai in 2005 found that some carried genetic markers consistent with European ancestry, though the results were not conclusive and the sample was small. Most historians regard the theory as fascinating but unproven. The physical characteristics could have many explanations. The genetic results were ambiguous. The documentary evidence is thin. And yet the town exists. And its old name means legion. And somewhere in the long gap between Kahi and the Chinese frontier, thousands of Roman soldiers simply vanish from history. A small town in northwestern China, perhaps carrying a memory it does not know it holds. Genghis Khan's tomb. Genghis Khan died in 1227, somewhere in the middle of a military campaign in northwestern China. The cause of his death is uncertain. Accounts vary between illness, a fall from a horse, and wounds sustained in battle. He was one of the most consequential individuals in human history, having united the Mongol tribes and forged an empire that would eventually become the largest contiguous land empire ever seen. Tens of millions of people died in his conquests. The political map of Asia was permanently redrawn. His tomb has never been found. According to Mongol tradition, Genghis Khan himself requested a secret burial, no monument, no marker, nothing that would allow enemies to desecrate his remains. The accounts that survive describe his body being carried back to Mongolia and buried in a remote location, with the burial party subsequently killing anyone who witnessed the procession, and then, according to some versions, killing themselves as well. Horses were reportedly ridden over the burial site to obliterate any trace. Trees were planted. Rivers were diverted. The location is believed to be somewhere in the Kentiai Mountains of northeastern Mongolia, a region considered sacred in Mongolian tradition and known as the Ekh Korig, or Great Taboo. For centuries, entry to this area was forbidden. Satellite imaging, ground-penetrating radar surveys, and archaeological expeditions have searched the region. Nothing has been definitively found. He wanted to be lost. And he succeeded. The lost treasure of the Knights Templar. On Friday the 13th of October, 1307, the origin, some historians suggest, of the association between that date and bad luck, King Philip IV of France ordered the simultaneous arrest of hundreds of Knights Templar across his kingdom. The Knights Templar had been founded in 1119 CE to protect Christian pilgrims in the Holy Land. Over 2 centuries they had become one of the wealthiest and most powerful organizations in the medieval world, banking, financing, owning properties across Europe and the Middle East, commanding their own military forces. Philip IV was heavily in debt to the order. The arrests were accompanied by charges of heresy and blasphemy, confessions extracted under torture, and culminated in the burning of the order's last Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, in 1314. But when the arrests were carried out, something was conspicuously absent: the Templar treasury. The enormous wealth of the order, gold, silver, precious objects, and documents, had vanished before the arrests. The Templar fleet, stationed at the port of La Rochelle, disappeared from the harbor overnight and was never accounted for. Where did the treasure go? Where did the fleet sail? Theories have circulated for 7 centuries. To Scotland, to Portugal, to the Americas, hidden underground in any number of locations that have been enthusiastically excavated without result. The honest answer is that no one knows. The wealth may have been distributed quietly among surviving members. The fleet may have sailed to friendly ports in Portugal. Some of it may simply be lost to history. But the question has never stopped being asked. The fate of the Knights Hospitallers fleet. The Knights Hospitaller, more formally, the Order of Knights of the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem, were the Templars' great rivals and eventual heirs. Founded around the same time, they survived the Templars' destruction and absorbed much of their territory and some of their membership. They were driven from the Holy Land, established themselves on the island of Rhodes, and then, after being expelled by the Ottomans in 1522, relocated to Malta, where they became the Knights of Malta, a sovereign military order that still exists today. But at various critical moments in the order's history, portions of its fleet and treasury disappeared from the historical record. The Hospitallers were a naval power of the First Order in the medieval Mediterranean, and their ships carried not only fighting men but the accumulated wealth and archives of the order. During the turbulent periods of their various expulsions and relocations, the precise fate of all their vessels and all their holdings cannot always be accounted for. Some galleys may have been lost at sea. Some assets were certainly seized by enemies. But the question of what the order managed to preserve and move, and where those reserves ultimately ended up, touches on the same tangled intersection of military history, religious wealth, and deliberate secrecy that makes the Templar mystery so enduring. 2 great orders of warrior monks. 2 trails of treasure that history cannot fully follow. The disappearance of the Chola navy. The Chola Empire of southern India was, at its height in the 11th century CE, one of the most powerful maritime forces in the world. Under the Emperor Rajendra Chola I, the empire launched a remarkable naval expedition around 1025 CE that crossed the Bay of Bengal and struck deep into Southeast Asia, raiding the kingdoms of the Malay Peninsula and Sumatra, capturing port cities, and returning with enormous plunder. It remains one of the most significant naval operations in medieval Asian history. The Chola navy was vast. Ancient inscriptions speak of hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of sailors. Their vessels were sophisticated enough to navigate open ocean and conduct coordinated amphibious operations across thousands of kilometers of sea. And then the empire declined. Internal struggles, invasions from neighboring powers, the gradual shift of trade routes. By the 13th century, the Chola Empire had effectively ceased to exist. What became of their fleet? Naval vessels of this period were wooden. They did not last. But the infrastructure of a great navy, the shipbuilding traditions, the accumulated nautical knowledge, the charts and pilot records, these things can survive in some form if a tradition is maintained. The dissolution of the Chola Empire appears to have broken that tradition fairly completely. The maritime dominance they had established in the Indian Ocean faded, and the knowledge base that had enabled their extraordinary reach was, if not lost, substantially dispersed and diminished. An empire that once commanded the sea, its sails gone, its charts scattered, its harbors silent. The fate of the Mughal peacock throne. In the early 17th century, the Mughal Emperor Shah Jahan, the man who would later build the Taj Mahal as a monument to his grief, commissioned a throne of almost incomprehensible magnificence. The peacock throne took 7 years to complete. It was encrusted with rubies, emeralds, pearls, and diamonds, including, reportedly, the legendary Koh-i-Noor diamond, which now sits in the British Crown Jewels, and the Timur ruby. The canopy above the throne was supported by 12 emerald columns and topped by 2 golden peacocks whose tails were spread in jeweled splendor. The throne's total value has been estimated in the billions of dollars in modern terms. It was the most expensive piece of furniture ever created. In 1739, the Persian conqueror Nader Shah sacked Delhi and carried the peacock throne back to Persia as war plunder. It was displayed in Tehran, and then Nader Shah was assassinated in 1747, and in the chaos that followed, the throne disappeared. It was broken up. Individual gems were dispersed. Pieces may have survived as components of later Iranian thrones, or been sold off, or simply melted down. What is described as the peacock throne in Iranian royal regalia from later periods almost certainly incorporates some elements of the original, but the throne as Shah Jahan made it is gone. The Kayachanur alone survived intact through a trail of conquest and transfer that eventually deposited it in London, where it remains. The most magnificent seat of power ever made, scattered into pieces across the world. The identity of the Babington plot traitor. In 1586, in the reign of Queen Elizabeth I of England, a conspiracy was uncovered that would seal the fate of Mary, Queen of Scots. The Babington plot, named for Anthony Babington, a young Catholic nobleman, was a plan to assassinate Elizabeth, trigger a Catholic uprising, and place Mary on the English throne with the support of Spain. The plot was discovered because Elizabeth's spymaster, Sir Francis Walsingham, had infiltrated it almost from the beginning. Coded letters passed between Babington and the imprisoned Mary were intercepted, deciphered, and used as evidence. Mary was tried and executed in 1587. Babington and his co-conspirators were hanged. But the question of the original informant, the person who first alerted Walsingham to the conspiracy's existence, or who helped plant the agent that penetrated it, has never been definitively established. Walsingham's intelligence network was sophisticated and compartmentalized, and he was famously secretive about his sources. The identity of certain key agents within the Babington conspiracy remains a matter of historical debate. Some historians have pointed to a figure known as Robert Poley, who was embedded within the conspiracy as an apparent co-conspirator while reporting to Walsingham. Others have suggested additional informants whose identities were so carefully protected that they never appeared in the surviving record. A conspiracy within a conspiracy. A spy inside the spy plot. And somewhere in the shadows of Elizabethan England, a face that history never got to see. The Man in the Iron Mask. Sometime around 1669, a prisoner was brought to a French jail, first to the fortress of Pignerol, then to the island prison of Sainte Marguerite, and finally to the Bastille in Paris, where he died in 1703. He was held under conditions of unusual secrecy. He was treated well, better than most prisoners, with fine food and good clothing, but his identity was concealed with extraordinary care. Guards were reportedly ordered never to let him be seen or heard. When he traveled between prisons, his face was covered. Voltaire, writing decades later, described the mask as iron. Contemporaries described it as black velvet. The details are uncertain. The existence of the prisoner is not, he appears in official records, referred to only as the prisoner or by the pseudonym Eustache Dorga. Who was he? This question has generated centuries of speculation. The most romantic theory, immortalized by Alexandre Dumas, is that he was the twin brother of King Louis XIV, concealed because a second heir would have destabilized the monarchy. There is no evidence for this. More credible scholarly theories have proposed he was a valet who had witnessed something dangerously secret at a high level of French politics. Others have suggested he was a disgraced diplomat, a spy, an illegitimate son of powerful figures, or a man who simply knew too much about a financial scandal. The French state went to extraordinary lengths to erase his identity, and succeeded. He died as he had lived, without a name that history could attach to a face. A man maintained in comfortable, careful silence for 30 years, whose name the most powerful government in Europe was afraid to speak. The 9 Unknown Men. In 273 BCE, the Emperor Ashoka of the Maurya Empire fought the Battle of Kalinga, one of the bloodiest conflicts in ancient Indian history, in which an estimated 100,000 people were killed and hundreds of thousands more were displaced. The carnage devastated Ashoka so profoundly that he renounced warfare, converted to Buddhism, and spent the rest of his reign promoting principles of nonviolence, tolerance, and welfare. He is remembered today as one of the most enlightened rulers in history. According to a legend that became famous in the 20th century, primarily through a 1923 book by the French author Louis Jacoliot and later popularized by the writer Talbot Munday, Ashoka also founded a secret society called the 9 Unknown Men. These 9 individuals were supposedly tasked with preserving and developing 9 categories of dangerous knowledge: propaganda, physiology, microbiology, alchemy, communication, gravitation, cosmogony, light, and sociology, and ensuring this knowledge was never misused by those who might weaponize it. The society was said to have operated in secret for over 2,000 years, its membership perpetually renewed, its books of knowledge never publicly released. There is no historical evidence that the 9 Unknown Men ever existed. The story appears to be a 20th century invention built on a vague foundation of legend. And yet the idea that somewhere 9 patient custodians hold the world's most dangerous secrets and choose not to release them has an enduring appeal that facts alone cannot fully extinguish. Sometimes the most powerful mysteries are the ones we invented ourselves. The Ghost Army of World War II. This mystery is different from the others in one important respect: it has an answer. But for nearly 50 years, that answer was classified, and the story, sealed away in government archives, was as unknown to the world as any ancient puzzle. In 1944, the United States Army deployed a secret unit to the European theater of World War II. It was called the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, and it consisted of roughly 1,100 soldiers. But it fought no battles in the conventional sense. What it did was deceive. The unit was staffed, remarkably, largely with artists, designers, actors, and sound engineers, many of them recruited from art schools and advertising agencies. Their mission was to impersonate entire divisions of the American Army, creating elaborate illusions to mislead German forces about the location and strength of Allied troops. They did this with inflatable tanks and trucks that looked real from the air, with truck convoys driving in circles to create the impression of massed vehicle movement, with powerful speakers broadcasting the recorded sounds of tank formations, with fake radio traffic designed to be intercepted, with soldiers visiting local cafes and dropping hints about fictional unit movements. The Ghost Army conducted over 20 deception operations. Military historians credit them with saving tens of thousands of lives by drawing German attention and firepower away from real Allied positions. It remained classified until 1996. The men who served in it went home and could not tell anyone what they had done, not their families, not their friends. Many of them were artists who returned to their studios and galleries and kept the secret for decades. An army of painters and actors, playing the largest performance of their lives, on a stage where the stakes were everything. Lost lands and phantom places. We leave the world of empires and armies behind now, and we move into something older and stranger, the geography of mystery. The places that were lost, or never found, or perhaps never existed at all. The islands that appeared on maps and then vanished. The roads beneath the sea. The ships found drifting with no one aboard. There is something particularly unsettling about geographical mysteries. We expect the world to stay where we put it. We expect land to remain land, islands to stay in their place, ships to arrive where they were headed. And yet the world has always been stranger than the maps suggest. The lost city of Atlantis. Around 360 BCE, the Greek philosopher Plato wrote two dialogues, the Timaeus and the Critias, in which he described, through the voice of his character Critias, a great civilization that had existed 9,000 years before his own time. This civilization was called Atlantis. According to the account, it was an island nation of extraordinary power and wealth, located beyond the Pillars of Hercules, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar. The Atlanteans had built a magnificent city of concentric rings of land and water, accumulated great power, and eventually grew corrupt and arrogant. The gods, displeased, sent earthquakes and floods that sank the island beneath the Atlantic Ocean in a single day and night. No account of Atlantis predates Plato. No ancient source other than his dialogues describes it. Most classical scholars believed, and most modern scholars believe, that Atlantis was a philosophical allegory, a story Plato invented to illustrate themes of hubris and divine justice. And yet the search for Atlantis has never stopped. Proposed locations have included the Mediterranean, the Atlantic Ocean, the Caribbean, Antarctica, and dozens of specific archaeological sites. The Minoan civilization, destroyed by the volcanic eruption of Thera around 1600 BCE, has been one of the most enduring candidates. The honest scholarly position is that Atlantis was almost certainly fictional. But the image, a magnificent civilization swallowed by the sea, lost beneath the waves, its towers and streets still standing somewhere in the dark water, is one that the human imagination has never been willing to entirely release. Perhaps because it feels like it should be true. Perhaps because all great things seem like they should leave more behind. The lost city of Atlantis. Around 360 BCE, the Greek philosopher Plato wrote two dialogues, the Timaeus and the Critias, in which he described, through the voice of his character Critias, a great civilization that had existed 9,000 years before his own time. This civilization was called Atlantis. According to the account, it was an island nation of extraordinary power and wealth, located beyond the Pillars of Hercules, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar. The Atlanteans had built a magnificent city of concentric rings of land and water, accumulated great power, and eventually grew corrupt and arrogant. The gods, displeased, sent earthquakes and floods that sank the island beneath the Atlantic Ocean in a single day and night. No account of Atlantis predates Plato. No ancient source other than his dialogues describes it. Most classical scholars believed, and most modern scholars believe, that Atlantis was a philosophical allegory, a story Plato invented to illustrate themes of hubris and divine justice. And yet the search for Atlantis has never stopped. Proposed locations have included the Mediterranean, the Atlantic Ocean, the Caribbean, Antarctica, and dozens of specific archaeological sites. The Minoan civilization, destroyed by the volcanic eruption of Thera around 1600 BCE, has been one of the most enduring candidates. The honest scholarly position is that Atlantis was almost certainly fictional. But the image, a magnificent civilization swallowed by the sea, lost beneath the waves, its towers and streets still standing somewhere in the dark water, is one that the human imagination has never been willing to entirely release. Perhaps because it feels like it should be true. Perhaps because all great things seem like they should leave more behind. The builder of the Yonaguni Monument. In 1986, a diver exploring the waters off the coast of Yonaguni Island, the westernmost island of Japan, close to Taiwan, encountered a remarkable underwater structure. The formation consisted of large, flat-topped rock terraces, sharp right-angle corners, what appeared to be steps and columns, and an overall geometry that seemed, to many observers, profoundly architectural. It sat at a depth of between 5 and 30 meters, covering an area roughly 150 meters long and 40 meters wide. The debate over the Yonaguni monument has been vigorous and unresolved ever since its discovery. Those who believe it is man-made point to the sharp angles, the apparent staircases, the flat surfaces, and the overall regularity of the structure. They note that the area was above water during the last ice age, roughly 10 to 12,000 years ago, when sea levels were much lower, which would have made it accessible to human builders. Those who believe it is natural point to the fact that the rock in the area is a fine-grained sandstone that fractures readily along horizontal and vertical planes, producing naturally angular formations. They note that no clearly artificial artifacts, tools, carvings, inscriptions, have been found in association with the structure. The Japanese government has not designated the site as a cultural property, effectively siding with the natural formation interpretation. But the debate among researchers continues. Steps leading down into the sea. Leading to what, or from what, we still do not know. The Bimini Road. In 1968, near the island of North Bimini in the Bahamas, a diver named J. Manson Valentine discovered something unexpected on the seafloor in shallow water. A formation of large, flat limestone stones, arranged in a curved line stretching for roughly half a mile. The stones remarkably regular in shape, fitting together with a neatness that seemed, to some observers, too orderly to be entirely natural. The discovery caused considerable excitement, partly because the psychic Edgar Cayce had, decades earlier, in the 1930s, predicted that ruins of Atlantis would be found near Bimini around 1968 or 1969. The apparent fulfillment of this prediction was noted enthusiastically by those inclined to believe in it. Subsequent geological study of the Bimini Road reached a less dramatic conclusion. Analysis of the stones showed that they were consistent with a naturally occurring phenomenon called beach rock, limestone that forms in layers and fractures along regular joints due to wave action and tidal stress, creating formations that can appear surprisingly regular and almost architectural. The mainstream scientific view is that the Bimini Road is a natural formation. A minority of researchers continue to dispute this, pointing to features of the stones that they argue are inconsistent with natural formation, the rounded corners, the seeming intentionality of the arrangement. A line of stones on the seafloor. Regular enough to make you wonder. Natural enough to resist the wondering. The lost colony of Roanoke. In 1587, a group of 115 English men, women, and children arrived on Roanoke Island, off the coast of what is now North Carolina, to establish the first English settlement in the Americas. Their governor, John White, sailed back to England for supplies shortly after their arrival. He was delayed by the war with Spain, the year of the Spanish Armada, and did not return to Roanoke until 1590. When he arrived, the settlement was empty. The colonists were gone. Every building had been dismantled. There were no signs of violence, no bodies, no evidence of a hasty departure. Carved into a fence post was a single word, Croatoan. Carved into a nearby tree, CRO. Croatoan was the name of a nearby island, and the name of the indigenous people who lived there. White had previously arranged with the colonists that if they moved, they would carve the name of their destination. If they were in distress, they would also carve a cross. There was no cross. White was unable to sail to Croatoan Island due to weather. He returned to England. And the fate of the colonists, 115 people, including his own daughter and granddaughter, the first English child born in the Americas, was never officially established. Modern archaeological work on Hatteras Island, the former Croatoan island, has found artifacts suggesting the colonists may have integrated with the local indigenous population. But no definitive evidence has closed the case. A single word on a post. And 115 people who simply walked out of English history into the American wilderness. The Green Children of Woolpit. In the 12th century, in the village of Woolpit in Suffolk, England, 2 children appeared. According to accounts written within a century of the event, by the chroniclers William of Newborough and Ralph of Coggeshall, the children were found near a wolf pit at the edge of the village. They were brother and sister. They spoke an unknown language. They would eat nothing at first, and then accepted only raw broad beans. And their skin was green. The children were taken in by a local knight. The boy sickened and died not long after. The girl survived, eventually losing her green color as her diet broadened, learning English, and reportedly living to adulthood and marrying. According to the accounts, when the girl could communicate, she said she and her brother had come from a place called St. Martin's Land, a subterranean realm where the sun never shone, lit only by a twilight glow, where all the inhabitants were green. What are we to make of this? Rational explanations have ranged from the children being Flemish immigrants whose unusual speech was mistaken for an unknown language, to a condition called hyperchromic anemia, severe iron deficiency, which can cause a greenish pallor in the skin. Others note that the accounts were written decades after the supposed events and may have been embellished or invented entirely. And some simply let the story stand as it is. Strange, unexplained, a small green mystery in the green English countryside. The Utsurabune mystery vessel. In 1803, on the coast of Japan, fishermen reported finding a strange vessel drifting in the water. The vessel was described as hollow and round, like a rice cooking pot or a ship's incense burner, roughly 3 meters in diameter, with a flat bottom and windows of glass or crystal set into its upper section. The outside was reportedly covered in metal fittings of unfamiliar design. Inside the vessel was a young woman. She was described as beautiful, with pale skin and red and white hair. She carried a small box which she would not allow anyone to touch. She spoke an unknown language and communicated through gestures that no one could interpret. The fishermen, uncertain what to do and apparently somewhat frightened, placed the woman back in her vessel and sent it drifting out to sea again. 3 contemporaneous accounts of this incident exist, written independently by different recorders. They agree in their main details, suggesting something genuinely happened, though the interpretation of what that something was differs enormously. Some researchers have proposed the Utsurabune as an early UFO encounter. An extraterrestrial visitor returned, unwelcomingly, to wherever she came from. Others suggest a more prosaic explanation, a foreign woman adrift in an unfamiliar vessel, a castaway from a ship of unknown origin. The vessel drifted back out to sea. The woman inside it, clutching her box, disappeared into the ocean as inexplicably as she had arrived. The fate of the Menelik coffin ship. Ethiopian tradition holds that the Emperor Menelik I, the legendary son of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, was the founder of the Solomonic dynasty and the bearer of the Ark of the Covenant from Jerusalem to Ethiopia. Layered within and around this tradition are accounts of ships, vessels said to have carried sacred objects, royal treasures, and significant persons at critical moments in Ethiopian and broader northeastern African history. The term Menelik coffin ships refers to accounts, largely preserved in Ethiopian ecclesiastical tradition and regional oral history, of vessels that transported objects of the highest sacred significance, including, In some versions, funerary or memorial items connected to royal or priestly lineages, across the waters of the Red Sea and Indian Ocean at various points in history. The details of these accounts vary considerably across different sources and traditions. What makes them historically interesting is the intersection of verifiable maritime history. Ethiopia and its predecessor states did engage in significant Red Sea trade, with layers of legend and religious significance that resist straightforward documentary verification. The sacred and the historical are closely intertwined in the Ethiopian tradition, and distinguishing one from the other requires a careful and respectful attention to the nature of the sources. Ships sailing on a sacred sea, carrying objects whose true nature history cannot fully verify. The Red Sea, calm and ancient, keeping its own counsel. The Mary Celeste. On the 4th of December, 1872, the British brigantine Dei Gratia was sailing through the Atlantic Ocean between the Azores and Portugal when its crew spotted another vessel. The ship was the Mary Celeste, an American merchant brigantine that had sailed from New York 8 days earlier, bound for Genoa with a cargo of industrial alcohol. It was sailing erratically, with some sails set strangely and others not set at all. When the Dei Gratia crew boarded it, they found the Mary Celeste perfectly intact, cargo undisturbed, provisions sufficient for 6 months, the captain's personal belongings untouched, a meal apparently half prepared in the galley. The ship's navigation equipment was largely present. There were no signs of violence, no signs of fire, no signs of any struggle. The captain, his wife and young daughter, and the crew of 10 people in total, were gone. The only lifeboat was missing. What happened to the people of the Mary Celeste has never been established. The most credible theory is that the cargo of industrial alcohol, which, being denatured, may have been particularly volatile, produced fumes that prompted the captain to order the crew into the lifeboat while the holds were ventilated. The lifeboat may then have become separated from the ship in rough weather, with all 10 people lost at sea. But no wreckage of the lifeboat was ever found. No bodies. No final message. A ship sailing itself across the Atlantic, tidy and intact, waiting for a crew that never came back. The Flannan Isles Lighthouse. The Flannan Isles are a small group of uninhabited rocks in the Outer Hebrides, off the northwest coast of Scotland, battered by some of the most severe Atlantic weather in the world. In 1899, a lighthouse was built there, a necessary beacon for ships navigating those dangerous waters. 3 keepers were assigned to staff it at any one time, maintaining the light, keeping logs, and enduring the isolation of one of the most remote postings in Britain. On the 15th of December, 1900, a passing ship noticed the Flannan Isles lighthouse was dark. A relief vessel arrived on the 26th of December to investigate. They found the lighthouse empty. All 3 keepers, James Duckett, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur, were gone. The lighthouse was in good order. The last log entry was dated the 15th of December. A meal was set on the table, partially eaten. Oilskins, waterproof coats, were hanging by the door, suggesting the keepers had not expected to go outside in bad weather. The most widely accepted explanation is that 2 of the men went to secure equipment on the western landing platform during a storm, were swept into the sea by a freak wave, and the 3rd man, seeing what had happened, rushed out without his oilskin to help, and was also swept away. Evidence of unusual wave damage on the island supports this theory. But it remains a reconstruction, not a confirmed account. 3 men on a rock in the Atlantic. A meal on the table. And then nothing, only the empty lighthouse and the sea. The SS Aurang Maidan. In February of 1948, the exact date varies between accounts, ships in the Strait of Malacca, between Sumatra and the Malay Peninsula, received a distress call. The signal was in Morse code, and it came from a Dutch merchant vessel called the SS Orang Medan. The message, as reportedly transcribed, read, "All officers including captain are dead, lying in chart room and on bridge. Possibly whole crew dead." A few more fragmented words followed. And then a final transmission, a series of dashes and dots that did not form words. And then silence. A nearby American vessel, the Silver Star, is reported to have located the Orang Medan and sent a boarding party. What they found, according to the accounts that exist, was the entire crew dead. Scattered across the decks and in the wheelhouse, expressions of terror frozen on their faces, arms outstretched as though fighting off something unseen. Even the ship's dog was dead, its face locked in a silent snarl. No injuries. No visible cause of death. No damage to the ship. As the boarding party prepared to tow the vessel to port, a fire broke out in the hold. The Silver Star crew abandoned the tow and retreated. Shortly afterward, the Orang Medan exploded and sank. This is where the mystery deepens in a different way, because no verified records of the SS Orang Medan appear to exist. No Dutch shipping registry confirms the vessel. No Lloyd's of London record acknowledges the Silver Star's distress response. The story appeared in print in the early 1950s and has circulated ever since, but its documentary foundation is exceptionally thin. Was the Orang Medan real? Or is it a maritime legend, a ghost story dressed in the details of factual reporting, that attached itself so convincingly to the format of a news account that it became indistinguishable from history? The most plausible physical explanation, if the incident occurred at all, involves the ship carrying an undeclared cargo of dangerous chemicals, perhaps potassium cyanide or nitroglycerine, that leaked and produced toxic fumes, killing the crew before the unstable cargo ignited. But no cargo manifest exists. No wreck has been found. No survivor ever came forward. The sea swallowed the ship, the crew, and the explanation, and what remains is only the story, drifting through maritime history like a vessel with no one at the wheel. Strange phenomena and unexplained events. We have traveled through lost civilizations, through vanished knowledge, through the ruins of empires and the edges of maps. We have stood at the door of the inexplicable and looked in. Now we go a little further. This chapter is about phenomena, things that happened, or things that were made, that do not fit comfortably into the world as we understand it. Events without adequate cause. Objects without adequate explanation. Moments where history looked at something and said, "We do not know what this is." The Dancing Plague of 1518. In July of 1518, in the city of Strasbourg, then part of the Holy Roman Empire, now in northeastern France, a woman named Frau Trophia stepped into the street and began to dance. She danced for days. She could not stop. Within a week, dozens of people had joined her. Within a month, the number had grown to somewhere between 400 and several hundred individuals, all dancing compulsively in the streets of Strasbourg, unable to cease, many of them collapsing from exhaustion, some reportedly dying from heart failure, stroke, or sheer physical depletion. The city authorities, bewildered, initially concluded that the afflicted needed to dance it out of their systems. They hired musicians to play and cleared a space for the dancers. This appears to have made things worse. Eventually the dancers were taken to a shrine and the outbreak subsided. By September, it was over. This event is documented in historical records, physician notes, sermons, city council decisions. It happened. The explanation for it, however, remains genuinely contested. The most widely accepted modern theory is mass psychogenic illness, a phenomenon in which psychological stress, particularly in populations experiencing severe hardship, manifests as physical symptoms that spread through a community like a contagion of the nervous system. Strasbourg in 1518 was experiencing famine, disease, and intense social anxiety. Other proposed explanations have included ergot poisoning, a fungal contamination of grain that can cause convulsions, and various neurological conditions. Hundreds of people, dancing in the summer streets until some of them died. And no explanation that fully satisfies. The Tunguska event. On the morning of the 30th of June, 1908, something exploded over a remote region of Siberia known as Tunguska. The explosion was, by any measure, extraordinary. It flattened an estimated 2,000 square kilometers of forest, roughly 80 million trees, all blown outward from a central point like spokes from a wheel. The shockwave was felt and recorded by seismographs across Europe. The atmospheric pressure wave circled the globe twice. The night skies over Europe and Asia glowed with unusual brightness for days afterward. In the immediate area, the destruction was total. Had the event occurred over a major city rather than an uninhabited Siberian forest, the death toll would have been catastrophic beyond reckoning. What caused it? The remoteness of the region meant that the first scientific expedition did not reach Tunguska until 1927, nearly 20 years after the event. What the researchers found was the devastated forest, radiating outward from the center. What they did not find was a crater, and they did not find significant amounts of meteorite material. The current scientific consensus is that a small asteroid or comet, estimated at between 50 and 80 meters in diameter, entered Earth's atmosphere and exploded in an airburst before reaching the ground, releasing energy equivalent to thousands of nuclear weapons. The absence of a crater and the scarcity of recovered material are consistent with an airburst. Microscopic silicate and magnetite spheres found in the soil are consistent with a stony asteroid. The largest impact event in recorded human history, and not a single person was confirmed killed. The forest absorbed it. The wilderness kept the secret for 20 years. The Iron Pillar of Delhi. In the courtyard of the Quwwat al-Islam Mosque in Delhi, India, there stands a pillar. It is approximately 7 meters tall, weighs over 6 tons, and is made almost entirely of iron. An inscription on its surface dedicates it to the Hindu god Vishnu and records it as a memorial to a king. Most historians believe this refers to Chandragupta II of the Gupta dynasty, placing its creation around the 4th or 5th century CE. The pillar is extraordinary for one specific reason: it has barely rusted. Despite standing in the open air for over 1,600 years, in a climate that includes a monsoon season with high humidity, the Delhi Iron Pillar shows only minimal surface corrosion. Most iron objects of that age and exposure would have deteriorated into unrecognizable fragments centuries ago. How did ancient Indian metallurgists create iron of such remarkable purity and corrosion resistance? Analysis of the pillar's composition has revealed that it contains an unusually high concentration of phosphorus, which promotes the formation of a thin protective layer of iron hydrogen phosphate on the metal's surface, a self-sealing film that inhibits further oxidation. The specific smelting techniques used by the craftsmen who made it appear to have naturally produced this composition. The mystery, then, is not supernatural. It is a testament to a level of metallurgical sophistication in Gupta-era India that was not understood by the outside world until modern materials science caught up with it. An iron pillar that refused to rust for 16 centuries, standing in the center of a city that grew up around it, keeping its method quietly to itself. The secret of the Ulfbert swords. In medieval Europe, most iron swords were made from a material called bloom iron, metal produced in small furnaces at temperatures that could not fully purify it. The resulting steel was mixed with impurities called slag, which made it brittle and prone to fracturing under the stresses of combat. And then there were the Unsolved swords. A group of approximately 170 swords found across Europe, dating from around 800 to 1000 CE and bearing a distinctive inlaid inscription reading VLF Bert, have been found on metallurgical analysis to be made of crucible steel, a material of dramatically higher purity and carbon content than any other European iron of the period. Crucible steel is flexible rather than brittle, strong under stress, and holds a sharper edge. The problem is that crucible steel was not supposed to exist in Viking Age Europe. The technique for producing it was known in the Middle East and Central Asia. It was the basis of the legendary Damascus steel, but required furnace temperatures that European metallurgy of the era was not believed capable of achieving. How did the makers of the Unsolved swords produce crucible steel in medieval Europe? Did they trade for the raw material along Volga River routes that connected Scandinavia to the Islamic world? Did they independently develop a smelting method that has not otherwise survived in the historical record? The swords exist. The steel is real. The how remains one of the quiet marvels of medieval metallurgy, still not fully resolved. The vanishing of the Tara brooch maker. In 1850, a small box of objects was found on a beach near Bettystown on the east coast of Ireland. Inside were pieces of early medieval Irish metalwork of extraordinary quality. The most significant piece came to be known as the Tara brooch, though it has no actual connection to the Hill of Tara, the name being a marketing invention by the dealer who later sold it. It dates to around the 8th century CE and is considered one of the supreme masterpieces of early medieval Celtic art. The brooch is tiny, just under 9 centimeters across. But every millimeter of its surface is covered in ornament of microscopic intricacy. Gold filigree panels containing patterns so fine they are barely visible to the naked eye. Amber and glass inserts. Animal interlace so densely worked that it requires magnification to fully appreciate. Modern jewelers and metalworkers who have studied the Tara brooch have described certain of its techniques as nearly impossible to replicate even with contemporary precision tools. The filigree work in particular, gold wire twisted and shaped into patterns on a scale of fractions of a millimeter, represents a level of manual skill and patience that is almost beyond comprehension. Who made it? We do not know. The craftsmen of early medieval Ireland left no signatures, no workshop records, no personal accounts. Their names are gone. What remains is their work, this small, astonishing object, speaking across 12 centuries in the language of extraordinary human hands. The origin of the Saqqara bird. In 1898, in a tomb at Saqqara in Egypt dating to approximately 200 BCE, archaeologists found a small wooden object. It was about 14 centimeters long, carved from sycamore wood, and shaped roughly like a bird, with a streamlined body, a distinctive upswept tail, and outstretched wings. What it conspicuously lacked were legs. For most of the century after its discovery, the Saqqara bird sat in the Cairo Museum classified as a bird figurine, unremarkable, one of many ancient Egyptian representations of birds with religious significance. In 1969, a researcher named Khalil Messihar re-examined it and proposed something remarkable, that the Saqqara bird was not a decorative representation of a bird at all, but a scale model of a glider. Its proportions, he argued, were more consistent with an aircraft than with any known species of bird. The wings were shaped with a dihedral angle, angled slightly upward from the body, which is a feature of aerodynamic design, not anatomical realism. The tail was vertical rather than horizontal, resembling a rudder. A model was constructed based on the Saqqara bird's proportions and reportedly demonstrated stable gliding flight when tested. Most Egyptologists remain skeptical, noting that ancient Egyptian art commonly depicted birds with non-naturalistic features for symbolic reasons, and that no other evidence of aviation knowledge exists in the Egyptian record. A small wooden bird, or a small wooden glider, resting in a museum case. Not saying which. The origin of the Dropa stones. In 1938, according to an account that first appeared in print in the 1960s, a Chinese archaeologist named Kai Piu Tei discovered a series of caves in the Biancarula Mountains on the border of China and Tibet. In the caves, the account claimed, were rows of small graves containing the skeletons of beings with unusually large heads and small, frail bodies. On the cave walls were carvings depicting the solar system. And scattered throughout the caves were stone discs, hundreds of them, each roughly 30 centimeters in diameter, with a hole in the center, and covered in a spiral groove that, on close examination, was found to contain microscopic hieroglyphic writing. The discs were allegedly translated years later by a professor named Tsum Nui, who reportedly claimed they described the crash landing of an alien spacecraft 12,000 years ago, and the fate of its crew, beings called the Dropa, who were stranded on Earth and gradually integrated with local populations. The Dropa stones have been investigated as a possible case of genuine ancient anomalous artifacts, and the investigation has consistently found the same thing: no verifiable evidence that they exist at all. No archaeologist named Kai Piu Tei appears in verifiable records. No professor named Tsum Nui can be traced. No museum or institution has produced the discs for examination. The story appears to have been fabricated, or at minimum substantially embellished, in the European fringe press of the 1960s. And yet the story spread, and grew, and has been repeated as fact in countless books and documentaries ever since. The mystery of the Dropa stones may ultimately be a mystery about how we create myths, and how quickly they become indistinguishable from history. The Koso artifact. In 1961, near the town of Atlantis in California, 3 people digging for geodes found a rock encrusted with what appeared to be a fossil shell. When they cut it open to examine the interior, they found something unexpected inside: a metal cylinder, surrounded by a wooden collar, encased in a ceramic material, an object that bore a striking resemblance to a modern spark plug. The outer casing of the find had been dated by some as potentially hundreds of thousands of years old, based on the hardite nodule in which it was encrusted. For those inclined toward the idea of lost advanced civilizations or ancient technology, the Koso artifact was electrifying, an anachronistic manufactured object, apparently embedded in ancient rock. In 1999, researchers who obtained photographs of the object and submitted them for analysis reached a prosaic conclusion. The Koso artifact appeared to be a 1920s champion spark plug, consistent in all its dimensions and features with that common automotive component. The encrustation, rather than being ancient, was likely the result of the mineral-rich desert environment acting on a relatively modern object over a period of decades. The original artifact has not been available for direct examination since the 1960s, and its current whereabouts are unknown. A spark plug in a rock. Not ancient technology, just a reminder that the desert is patient, and that encrustation does not always mean antiquity. The Sailing Stones of Death Valley. In the Racetrack Playa, a dry lakebed in Death Valley, California, there are rocks that move. Large stones, some weighing hundreds of kilograms, leave long trails across the cracked mud surface of the playa, tracks stretching for dozens of meters, sometimes turning corners, sometimes running parallel to other tracks, occasionally looping back on themselves. The stones sit at the ends of their trails, apparently having arrived there under their own power. No one had ever witnessed the movement directly. For decades, the Sailing Stones of Death Valley were a genuine mystery, observed, documented, measured, but never explained, because the movement appeared to happen when no one was watching. In 2014, a team of researchers finally caught it happening. The mechanism turns out to be elegantly simple. In winter, thin sheets of ice form on the playa overnight. As temperatures rise in the morning, the ice begins to melt and break into floating panels. Wind catches these ice panels and pushes them across the surface. The edges of the moving ice push against the rocks, not hard enough to lift or tumble them, but enough, given a long enough time and a slick enough mud surface beneath, to send them sliding slowly forward, leaving their trails behind. The mystery is solved. And yet something about the image remains quietly wonderful. Enormous rocks, drifting across a desert lake bed, guided by the invisible hands of ice and wind, leaving records of a journey no human eye had ever watched. The identity of the Roman dodecahedron's maker. Scattered across the former territory of the Roman Empire, concentrated particularly in the northern provinces, Gaul, Germany, Britain, there are small bronze objects of a very specific and peculiar shape. They are dodecahedrons, 12-sided geometric objects, each face a pentagon, each face bearing a circular hole of varying diameter, with small knobs at each vertex. They range from 4 to 11 centimeters in size. Over 100 have been found, in Roman contexts dating from the 2nd to the 4th century CE. No ancient text mentions them. No Roman writer describes their use. They appear in no artistic depictions. They carry no inscriptions. They are frequently found in coin hoards, suggesting they were considered valuable. But what they were for, nobody knows. Proposed functions have included surveying instruments, candle holders, dice, knitting tools for making finger gloves, astronomical instruments for determining planting dates, military range-finding devices, and religious or ritual objects. Some of these proposals have been tested experimentally and found to work. The dodecahedrons can be used for some of these purposes. But being usable as something does not mean that was their purpose. Over 100 identical objects, spread across an empire, made by unknown craftsmen for an unknown purpose, never once mentioned in 2,000 years of Roman writing. The most common objects are often the ones that no one thinks to explain. The extraordinary things get written about. The everyday things just get used, and their purpose dies with the people who used them. The secret of the Palais Kouros statue. In the 1980s and 1990s, archaeologists excavating the site of Palais on the eastern coast of Crete, a significant Minoan settlement, discovered fragments of something remarkable. Piece by piece, they recovered the remains of a composite statue, a figure approximately 50 centimeters tall, assembled from multiple materials, a body of carved hippopotamus ivory, inlaid with gold, with eyes of rock crystal and pupils of obsidian, set onto a serpentine base. The craftsmanship was of the very highest Minoan quality, dating to around 1480 BCE. The statue depicted a young male figure in a striding pose, what classical scholars call a kouros, meaning youth. Based on its context and iconography, most researchers believe it represented a divine figure, possibly the young Minoan god who appears in other religious imagery, a deity associated with nature, renewal, and perhaps the cycles of the year. The statue had been deliberately destroyed in antiquity, smashed and scattered, apparently as an act of deliberate desecration, possibly during a period of conflict or cultural upheaval on the island. The questions it raises are layered. Who was the god it depicted? What rituals was it used in? Who destroyed it, and why? What moment of crisis or conquest prompted someone to shatter this beautiful and sacred object and scatter the pieces? The restored statue now stands in the Sisha Archaeological Museum, its fracture lines still visible, a beautiful object that carries its own violent history in the cracks between its pieces. The fate of the Nebra Sky Disk's creators. In 1999, on a hilltop in the Ziegelrode forest in Saxony-Anhalt, Germany, looters using metal detectors illegally excavated what turned out to be one of the most extraordinary archaeological finds of the 20th century. The Nebra Sky Disk is a circular bronze disk, roughly 30 centimeters in diameter, inlaid with gold symbols, a crescent moon, what appears to be a full moon or sun, a cluster of stars that corresponds to the Pleiades, and two arcing bands along the disk's edges, plus a lower arc that may represent a solar boat. It dates to approximately 1600 BCE, the early Bronze Age in Central Europe, making it the oldest known realistic depiction of the cosmos anywhere in the world. The disk appears to have had astronomical function. The angle of the golden arcs corresponds to the difference between the summer and winter solstice horizons at the latitude where it was found. The Pleiades cluster was used in Bronze Age Europe to mark the agricultural calendar. Their appearance in spring signaled planting time. Their disappearance in autumn signaled harvest. The people who made this object, who cast the bronze, hammered the gold, mapped the sky onto a disk with such precision, left no other written record. Their names, their language, their specific beliefs and social organization are unknown to us. They existed at a time before literacy had reached Central Europe. And yet they looked up at the same sky we look up at. They knew the Pleiades. They understood the solstices. They made something beautiful and functional and buried it carefully on a hilltop, perhaps as an offering, perhaps for safekeeping. It waited there for 3,500 years, until someone found it and pulled it from the earth. A map of the sky, made by people who left no other map of themselves. Strangers with no identity. We have spent much of this journey with things, with objects, with places, with events. Now we turn to people. Not famous people. Not kings or generals or philosophers. Ordinary strangers, people who appeared in history without explanation, without origin, sometimes without even a name. People who were found, examined, buried, and never fully understood. There is something uniquely haunting about an unidentified person. We are social creatures. We build our understanding of each other on context, on names, on histories, on the networks of relationship that place a person in the world. Strip all of that away, and what remains is a kind of profound loneliness, a human being reduced to a puzzle. These are 6 of those puzzles. 6 strangers who have never been fully explained. The Tawed Man. In July of 1954, at Tokyo International Airport, a man arrived on a flight from Europe. According to the account, which has been repeated in books on anomalous phenomena for decades, the man spoke French and several other languages fluently, carried what appeared to be a valid passport from a country called Tawed, and was entirely baffled by the suggestion that Tawed did not exist. He pointed to a map. Where Tawed should have been, on the border between France and Spain, was the small principality of Andorra. The man had apparently never heard of Andorra. His passport, by his account, was entirely in order, stamped with multiple previous entries to Japan from legitimate business trips. His company, his hotel, his bank, all real, all verified, but none with any record of him. Immigration authorities detained him overnight in a hotel room with guards posted at the door. In the morning, he was gone. Vanished from a locked room. His documents, passport, currency bearing the name of Tawed, also gone. No trace was ever found. The story of the Tawed Man has become one of the foundational tales of parallel universe theory in popular culture. The suggestion that this man had somehow crossed from a world where Tawed existed into one where it did not. No contemporary documentation of the incident has ever been produced. No official Japanese immigration record. No newspaper account from 1954. The story appears to have entered print some years after its alleged occurrence, through sources that cannot be traced to verified eyewitnesses. Real or invented, the image endures, a man at a customs desk, pointing to a place on a map that is not there, utterly certain of a home that no one else can find. The Somerton Man. On the 1st of December, 1948, a man was found dead on Somerton Beach in Adelaide, Australia. He was well-dressed, well-nourished, and appeared to be in his 40s. He carried no identification. Every label had been carefully removed from his clothing. No one came forward to identify him. His fingerprints matched no record. His face, circulated in newspapers across Australia and internationally, was recognized by no one. The cause of death was undetermined. Toxicology found no definitive poison, though the pattern of symptoms suggested one. He appeared to have simply sat down on the beach and died. In a secret pocket sewn into the waistband of his trousers, investigators found a small, tightly rolled piece of paper. On it were printed two words in Persian, tamam shud, meaning ended or finished. The paper had been torn from a rare edition of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. The book itself was eventually found, having been left in an unlocked car near the beach. In the back cover were penciled letters, apparently a code, and a telephone number. The number connected to a nurse who denied knowing the man, but was reportedly deeply shaken by the investigation. A bust made of the Somerton Man bore a striking resemblance to her son, who was born around the time she would have known the deceased. In 2022, DNA analysis of the Somerton Man's exhumed remains provided a potential lead, a possible identity as a man named Carl Webb, an electrical engineer from Melbourne. The identification has not been universally accepted and the investigation continues. A man on a beach, his labels removed, a poem about endings in his pocket. Still not fully known. The Tamam Shud case. The Tamam Shud case and the Somerton Man are deeply intertwined. The torn page found in his pocket is the most famous element of his mystery, and it deserves a moment of its own. The Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam is a collection of Persian quatrains, short, philosophical poems about mortality, transience, and the enjoyment of life in the face of inevitable ending. The phrase Tamam Shud appears at the very end of the collection, as its final words. The edition from which the page was torn was rare. Only a handful of copies of that specific printing were known to exist. The copy found in the unlocked car was eventually traced through public appeals, but its owner could not be conclusively connected to the dead man. The code penciled into the back of the book, 5 lines of capital letters, apparently random, has been studied by cryptographers and amateur codebreakers for over 70 years. It has never been solved. Some believe it is not a cipher at all but a set of initials, the first letters of words in a message that only the intended recipient could decode. Others believe it is a genuine encrypted message whose key was never found. A dead man. A torn poem about endings. A code that has outlasted everyone who might have known what it meant. Tamam Shud. Finished. And yet, somehow, not. The Isdal Woman. On the 29th of November, 1970, a father hiking with his 2 daughters in the Isdalen Valley near Bergen, Norway, found a body. The woman had been badly burned. Around her were the remnants of her belongings, also burned. She had suffered blunt force trauma to the neck. The official ruling was ambiguous between murder and suicide. She was never identified. Like the Somerton Man, her clothing labels had been removed. Her teeth had been treated by a dentist whose work could not be matched to any known practitioner. Her fingerprints matched no record. Attempts to trace her movements before her death revealed that she had traveled extensively through Europe under multiple false identities, staying in hotels across Norway under different names, always paying in cash, always seemingly alert to surveillance. The behavior pattern suggested a professional, a spy, perhaps, or someone operating in the gray spaces between intelligence agencies in the early Cold War years. Bergen, as a port city, was of strategic significance during that period. Norwegian police reopened the case in 2016, using modern forensic techniques to build a detailed physical and genetic profile. Isotope analysis of her teeth suggested she had grown up in a German-speaking region of Central Europe. Genetic analysis suggested Central European ancestry. A name has not been confirmed. The Isdal woman, as she is known, named for the valley where she was found, remains unidentified. A woman who moved through Europe like a shadow, and left it the same way. The identity of the unknown warrior in Westminster Abbey. On the 11th of November, 1920, the second anniversary of the armistice that ended the First World War, an unidentified British soldier was buried with full honours in Westminster Abbey, among the kings and poets and statesmen of England. The unknown warrior had been selected from among 4 unidentified bodies exhumed from the major battle areas of the Western Front: the Aisne, the Somme, Arras, and Ypres. A blindfolded officer chose one of the 4 at random. The others were reburied. No one knows which battlefield yielded the soldier who now lies in Westminster. He could be any of hundreds of thousands of men. A private or an officer. A volunteer or a conscript. He could have died on the first day of the Somme, in the mud of Passchendaele, in a quiet sector on an unremarkable morning. The deliberate unknowability is the point. He was chosen precisely because he could not be identified, because he could therefore be everyone. Every family in Britain that had lost a son or husband or brother and never received remains could look at that grave and find, in the anonymity, a kind of answer. His name is not on the grave. The inscription reads, "A British warrior who fell in the Great War 1914 to 1918 for king and country." The most visited grave in Britain. The most deliberately unknown person in the country's history. A mystery that was made, with intention and grief, to stand for all the mysteries that could never be solved. The Pollock twins' reincarnation. In May of 1957, in the town of Hexham in Northumberland, England, 2 young girls, Joanna and Jacqueline Pollock, aged 11 and 6, were killed when a car mounted the pavement and struck them on their way to church. Their parents were devastated. Their father, John Pollock, was a devout believer in reincarnation, an unusual belief for a Catholic in England at the time, and he became convinced that his daughters would be reborn. A year later, his wife became pregnant with twins. The girls, Jennifer and Gillian, were born in 1958. John Pollock noted that Jennifer was born with 2 birthmarks in positions that corresponded to marks his deceased daughter Jacqueline had carried, one on the forehead, one on the hip. As the twins grew old enough to speak, they reportedly made statements that their parents found inexplicable, recognizing toys that had belonged to their deceased sisters, toys they had never seen. Referring to places in Hexham that they had not visited. Expressing fear of cars in ways that seemed specific and unusual. The case was studied by Dr. Ian Stevenson of the University of Virginia, who spent decades collecting and analyzing cases suggestive of reincarnation. He considered the Pollock case one of the more compelling in his dataset, while acknowledging the considerable methodological difficulties in evaluating such accounts. Skeptics point to the strong prior belief of the father as a significant source of potential bias, that a parent convinced of reincarnation would be predisposed to interpret the normal behavior of young children through that lens. What the twins themselves believed as adults, they kept largely private. Two girls born into grief. Two girls who may or may not have remembered something that cannot be remembered. A question that sits at the very boundary of what we believe the self to be. Unsolved murders and criminal mysteries. We have spoken of civilizations that vanished, of knowledge that was lost, of people who appeared without explanation. Now we speak of things done in the dark, crimes that were committed, lives that were taken, and justice that never came. These are difficult mysteries. Not difficult to hear, you are safe, you are warm, the night around you is quiet, but difficult in the sense that they carry real weight. Real people are at the center of each of them. Real grief. We will treat them with the care they deserve. The facts, plainly spoken. The questions, honestly held. No sensationalism. Just the quiet acknowledgement that some wrongs were never righted, and that the not knowing is its own kind of weight. The Princes in the Tower. In the summer of 1483, two boys disappeared into the Tower of London and were never seen again. The boys were Edward V, 12 years old, and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York, aged 9, the sons of the recently deceased King Edward IV of England. Their uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, had been appointed their protector. He had declared them illegitimate, assumed the throne as Richard III, and placed them in the Tower, ostensibly for their safety. After the summer of 1483, the princes were simply not seen again. Richard III reigned for 2 years before being killed at the Battle of Bosworth Field, and the Tudor dynasty began. Henry VII had every political incentive to publish proof that Richard had murdered his nephews. He never did, possibly because he couldn't, or possibly because he had reasons of his own for silence. In 1674, workmen in the Tower found the bones of 2 children buried beneath a staircase. They were assumed to be the princes and reinterred in Westminster Abbey. The bones have never been subjected to modern DNA analysis. Requests to examine them have been declined by the Crown. Richard III remains the most commonly accused murderer, but the evidence is circumstantial. Other candidates have included Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, and even Henry VII himself. 2 children, placed in a fortress for their protection, who simply ceased to exist in the historical record. The Tower kept its secret then, and the Abbey keeps it still. The Lizzie Borden Case. On the morning of the 4th of August, 1892, in Fall River, Massachusetts, Andrew and Abby Borden were found dead in their home, killed by a hatchet. Andrew Borden was a wealthy businessman, widely disliked for his miserliness. Abby was his second wife. The only other person in the house at the time, aside from the maid who was working upstairs, was Andrew's 32-year-old daughter Lizzie. Lizzie Borden was arrested, tried, and acquitted. The jury deliberated for barely an hour. The case against her was circumstantial but suggestive. She had been observed burning a dress in the kitchen stove 3 days after the murders, a dress she said was stained with paint. She had given inconsistent statements about her whereabouts during the killings. She had recently attempted to purchase prussic acid from a pharmacy, reportedly for cleaning purposes. The case against conviction was also strong. No blood was found on Lizzie. No murder weapon was conclusively identified. The timeline made it logistically difficult for a single person to commit both murders without being noticed. After her acquittal, Lizzie continued to live in Fall River until her death in 1927. She never publicly addressed the murders. She never explained what she knew. The famous nursery rhyme, 40 whacks, 41, is almost certainly not accurate to the actual injuries. But the question it implies has never been answered. She was acquitted. That is not the same as innocent. And it is not the same as guilty. The truth of that August morning died with everyone who was there. The Bagshot Heath poisoner. In the late 19th century, in the heathland of Surrey, England, a series of suspicious deaths among travellers and local residents raised the spectre of a systematic poisoner operating in the area. The specific cluster of cases associated with the Bagshot Heath poisoner involved individuals who died under circumstances that contemporaries found difficult to attribute to natural causes, deaths that came too quickly, that involved symptoms consistent with arsenical or other chemical poisoning, and that occurred in a geographic area and time frame close enough together to suggest a common cause. Victorian England had a complicated relationship with poison. It was freely available in many forms. Arsenic was sold openly as a pesticide and was found in wallpaper dyes, fabric colorings, and numerous household products. Death by poison was common enough that it was sometimes called inheritance powder in darker circles. The toxicology of the era was imprecise enough that many poisonings went undetected, and enough went misattributed that the question of deliberate criminal poisoning in any specific cluster of deaths is genuinely difficult to resolve retrospectively. Whether a single individual operated as a deliberate poisoner on Bagshot Heath, or whether the deaths were coincidental, environmental, or the result of different causes, was never definitively established. A heath in Surrey. A cluster of quiet deaths. And the particular Victorian anxiety that death, in that era, might be closer and more deliberate than anyone wished to admit. The Hinterkaifeck murders. On the 21st of March, 1922, 6 people were killed at a small farmstead called Hinterkaifeck, in rural Bavaria, Germany. The victims were the farmer Andreas Gruber, his wife Casilia, their widowed daughter Victoria, her 2 children, and a maid who had only just arrived to work at the farm. They were killed with a mattock, a type of farm tool with a pickaxe-like head, in the farmyard and inside the house. The murders were not discovered for several days. Neighbors had noticed that no one from the farm had attended church or the market, and that the cattle were unmilked. When they investigated, they found the bodies, and discovered something that made the case still stranger. Evidence suggested that the killer had remained at the farmstead after the murders for several days. The animals had been fed. Food had been consumed from the kitchen. The fires had been kept going. Someone had stayed in the house with the bodies. In the weeks before the killings, Andreas Gruber had reported finding unfamiliar footprints in the snow leading from the forest to the farm, but no return footprints. He had told neighbors someone had been living in the farm's outbuildings. The previous maid had left the farm, reportedly because she felt the house was haunted. Over 100 suspects were investigated over the following years. The case was never solved. A farm in the Bavarian countryside. Footprints in the snow that led in but not out. And someone who stayed, in silence, among the dead. Jack the Ripper's identity. In the autumn of 1888, in the Whitechapel district of London's East End, a neighbourhood of extreme poverty, overcrowding, and desperate lives, a series of murders took place that would become perhaps the most famous unsolved criminal case in history. The canonical victims attributed to the Ripper No. 5, Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly, all women working in prostitution, all killed between August and November of 1888, all with wounds of a nature that suggested both rage and a degree of anatomical knowledge. The killer was never identified. The case was never closed. And the name Jack the Ripper, taken from letters sent to police and press that may or may not have been from the actual killer, became one of the most recognizable monikers in criminal history. Over 100 suspects have been seriously proposed over the subsequent century and a half. The list includes a Polish barber, a failed doctor, a member of the royal family, a painter, a barrister, and many others. None has been proven. The evidence that would allow certainty, contemporaneous forensic evidence of the kind modern investigation would collect simply does not exist. What does exist is a neighborhood and a moment in history, the gaslit streets of Whitechapel, the fog, the poverty that made certain women invisible to the society around them. The victims are often lost in the mythology of the killer's name. They were real people. They had lives before that autumn. The Ripper's identity is unknown. The lives of his victims are recoverable, if anyone chooses to look. The Black Dahlia Murder. On the 15th of January, 1947, in a vacant lot in Los Angeles, a woman's body was found. The body had been posed deliberately. It had been completely drained of blood and thoroughly cleaned. It had been severed at the waist. The victim's face had been cut from the corners of her mouth toward her ears, an injury that became known as the Glasgow Smile. She was identified as Elizabeth Short, 22 years old, an aspiring actress from Massachusetts who had come to Los Angeles in the way that many young people did in that era, drawn by the light and the possibility of the movies. The case immediately became a media sensation. The nickname Black Dahlia was applied by newspapers, and has remained one of the most obsessed over unsolved murders in American history. The Los Angeles Police Department investigated hundreds of suspects over the following years. Dozens of men confessed, a common occurrence with high-profile cases, confessions coming from disturbed individuals with no actual connection to the crime. None of the confessions held up. The level of staging and the absence of blood at the scene indicated the murder and mutilation had taken place elsewhere, and the body transported. This suggested planning, access to a private space, and a car. It narrowed nothing. Elizabeth Short was 22 years old. She came to Los Angeles to become something. She became, instead, a mystery that has outlasted almost everyone who was alive when it was committed. The Zodiac Killer. Between 1968 and 1969, in the San Francisco Bay Area of California, a serial killer murdered at least 5 people and wounded 2 others. The killer called himself the Zodiac. He sent taunting letters to police and newspapers, some containing coded messages, ciphers that he claimed, if solved, would reveal his identity. The first cipher was cracked relatively quickly by a schoolteacher and his wife. It did not contain a name. The Zodiac claimed in his letters to have killed as many as 37 people. This claim has never been verified. 5 confirmed victims and 2 survivors constitute the established record. The Zodiac letters continued into the early 1970s and then stopped. The murders stopped. Whether the killer died, was imprisoned for other crimes, or simply ceased, is unknown. In 2020, a group of amateur codebreakers calling themselves the Zodiac Cipher Crackers solved a cipher that had gone unsolved for 51 years. The solved text contained no identifying information, just a taunting message about the killer's psychology and his contempt for police. Hundreds of suspects have been investigated over 5 decades. The case remains officially open. The San Francisco Police Department has stated that they continue to receive tips. Letters sent to newspapers. Ciphers left to be decoded. A killer who wanted to be known but refused to be found. The Monster of Florence. Between 1968 and 1985, in the hills and countryside around Florence, Italy, a serial killer murdered 16 people, 8 couples, at outdoor locations. The Italian press called the killer Illinois Mostro, the monster. The crimes followed a pattern: couples parked in isolated spots at night, killed by gunfire and then subjected to mutilation. The same gun, a .22 caliber Beretta, was used in all the confirmed killings, linking them definitively to a single perpetrator. The case was investigated for decades, generating one of the most complex and contentious criminal investigations in Italian history. Several men were convicted at various points. A farmhand named Pietro Pacciani was convicted in 1994 and then had his conviction overturned, but no final, certain answer has emerged. The investigation expanded over time to encompass theories of a secret society of Florentine elites who allegedly ordered the killings and received trophies from the crime scenes. These theories, while sensational, were never proven. The writer Douglas Preston lived near Florence in the late 1990s and became entangled in the investigation after a prosecutor became convinced Preston himself was involved. He wrote about the experience in a book that illuminated the extraordinary dysfunction of the investigation. The monster of Florence was never conclusively identified. The hills outside the city remain, as beautiful as ever, keeping whatever they know. The Yuba County Five. On the evening of February 24, 1978, 5 young men with intellectual disabilities attended a college basketball game in Chico, California, with a friend who drove them there. Their driver left them briefly to speak with someone in the parking lot after the game. When he returned to his car, all 5 were gone. The 5 men, Gary Mathias, Ted Weiher, Jack Madruga, Bill Sterling, and Jackie Hewitt, were found over the following months. 4 of the bodies were discovered in a remote Forest Service trailer in the Sierra Nevada mountains, approximately 65 miles from where they had disappeared. 1, Gary Mathias, was never found. How they got there is unknown. Their car was found nearby, apparently having driven off a mountain road. The trailer showed signs of extended habitation. Food had been consumed over a period of weeks. 1 man had survived for some time after the others died. No clear explanation has ever been established for why 5 young men with intellectual disabilities drove 65 miles into the mountains in winter, or what happened to them there. The case has been examined in detail by researchers who find it resistant to any single coherent explanation. 5 young men who went to a basketball game and ended up somewhere no one can fully account for. A mystery made more poignant by the vulnerability of those at its center. The Jameson family deaths. In October of 2009, Bobby and Sherilyn Jameson and their 6-year-old daughter Madison were reported missing in Latimer County, Oklahoma. Their truck was found abandoned on a remote dirt road in the Panola Mountain area. Inside were their wallets, identification, cell phones, and nearly $32,000 in cash. Their dog was in the truck, alive but starved. The family was not. 4 years later, in 2013, the skeletal remains of all 3 were found approximately 3 miles from where the truck had been abandoned, in rugged, heavily wooded terrain. The cause of death was undetermined. There was no clear evidence of foul play, but nothing to definitively rule it out either. The family had been experiencing a number of serious difficulties in the period before their disappearance: financial stress, conflict with neighbors, and what family members described as an unusual preoccupation with spiritual warfare and demonic presence. A security camera at a storage unit they visited on the day of their disappearance captured footage of the couple moving boxes. Their expressions, observers noted, appeared blank and detached, though the interpretation of facial expression in low-resolution security footage is inherently subjective. The medical examiner's report was inconclusive. The investigation remains open. A family, a truck full of everything they owned, 3 miles of wilderness, and no answer that fully holds together. The disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa. On the 30th of July, 1975, James Riddle Hoffa, Jimmy Hoffa, the former president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, one of the most powerful labor union leaders in American history, left for a lunch meeting at a restaurant in suburban Detroit. He was never seen again. Hoffa was a complex figure. He had built the Teamsters into a formidable force, winning significant gains for truck drivers and warehouse workers across the country. He had also, over years of investigation, been linked to organized crime, connections that eventually led to his imprisonment for jury tampering and fraud under the Kennedy administration's aggressive pursuit of mob-linked labor leaders. After his release from prison in 1971, Hoffa attempted to reclaim leadership of the Teamsters. This brought him into conflict with the organized crime figures who had developed a comfortable arrangement with his successor. The lunch meeting of July 30th was reportedly connected to this dispute. The FBI has investigated Hoffa's disappearance for nearly 50 years. Multiple sites have been excavated based on tips from informants: a New Jersey horse farm, a driveway in suburban Detroit, a field in Oakland County. None has produced his remains. Several individuals have claimed, at various points, to know what happened. The accounts differ in their details. None has led to a confirmed discovery. In 1982, Jimmy Hoffa was legally declared dead. His body has never been found. His killer, if there was one, has never been charged. A man who spent his life fighting on behalf of working people, who was swallowed by the world of power he had moved in, who stepped out of a restaurant parking lot and into the permanent silence of unsolved history. Modern disappearances. From the Stone Age to the medieval world, from the bottom of the ocean to the courts of empires. We have held 100 questions up to the light and watched them remain, stubbornly, questions. This chapter is different from all the others. These mysteries did not happen thousands of years ago, or even hundreds. They happened in living memory, some of them within the last few decades. They involve people whose names are household words, and events that unfolded in the age of cameras and newspapers and radio. The disappearance of Amelia Earhart. Amelia Earhart was the most famous aviator in the world, the first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic, a symbol of possibility in an era when women's ambitions were routinely clipped. In 1937, she attempted to become the first person to fly around the world along an equatorial route. She was 40 years old. Her navigator was Fred Noonan. Their aircraft was a Lockheed Electra 10E, one of the most advanced planes of its time. On the 2nd of July, 1937, somewhere over the central Pacific Ocean, they disappeared. They were attempting to locate Howland Island, a tiny sliver of land in the vast Pacific, when radio communications became fragmented and then stopped altogether. The United States Navy conducted the largest air and sea search in its history to that point. No wreckage, no remains, and no confirmed evidence of their fate was found. The official conclusion was that they ran out of fuel, ditched in the ocean, and were lost at sea. This remains the most widely accepted explanation. But alternative theories have persisted. One of the most credible, supported by the International Group for Historic Aircraft Recovery, proposes that Earhart and Noonan landed on the reef of a remote island called Nikumaroro and survived for some time as castaways before dying there. Bone fragments found on the island in 1940 were examined at the time and dismissed as male, but a 2018 forensic reanalysis suggested they were more consistent with a woman of Earhart's stature. The bones were subsequently lost. Underwater searches of the Nikumaroro Reef have continued in recent years, so far without definitive result. A woman who spent her life pushing at the edges of what was thought possible, lost at an edge of the world that gave nothing back. The Lindbergh baby kidnapping. On the night of the 1st of March, 1932, someone climbed a ladder to a second-floor window of a farmhouse in Hopewell, New Jersey, and took a 20-month-old child from his crib. The child was Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr., the son of Charles Lindbergh, the most celebrated man in America, the pilot who had completed the first solo transatlantic flight just 5 years earlier. The kidnapping became instantly the most publicized crime in the country's history. A ransom of $50,000 was paid. The child was not returned. In May 1932, the decomposed body of a toddler was found in the woods not far from the Lindbergh home, identified as the missing child. He had died from a blow to the head, likely on the night of the kidnapping. In 1934, a German-born carpenter named Bruno Richard Hauptmann was arrested after ransom money was traced to him. He was convicted and executed in 1936, maintaining his innocence until the end. The case is officially closed, but it has never been entirely settled in the minds of those who have studied it closely. Hauptmann's guilt has been contested by some researchers who point to gaps in the evidence, the conduct of the investigation, and the possibility that others were involved, or that Hauptmann was entirely innocent. A child taken from a crib in the night. A ransom paid. A man executed. And a question that refused, even after all of that, to fully close. The D.B. Cooper hijacking. On the 24th of November, 1971, the day before Thanksgiving, a man boarded a Northwest Orient flight from Portland, Oregon to Seattle, Washington. He used the name Dan Cooper. He ordered a bourbon and soda. And then he passed a note to a flight attendant informing her that he had a bomb. In Seattle, he negotiated the release of the passengers in exchange for $200,000 in $20 bills and 4 parachutes. Both were delivered. The plane then took off again, heading south toward Mexico City, at low altitude and with the rear air stair deployed. Somewhere over the forests of southwestern Washington, between Seattle and Reno, Dan Cooper jumped out of the back of the plane into a cold and rainy night with $200,000 strapped to his body. He has never been found. The FBI investigation, the longest running in Bureau history, was officially suspended in 2016, though tips are still accepted. In 1980, a young boy found a small bundle of the ransom money, partially decomposed, on the banks of the Columbia River. The serial numbers matched. No other trace of Cooper or the money has ever been found. Whether he survived the jump, at night, in the rain, over dense wilderness, without proper skydiving equipment, is itself debated. Many investigators believe he almost certainly died. But no body, no parachute, no further money has ever been recovered. A man with a fake name, a bourbon, and $200,000, stepping out of a plane into the dark. The only unsolved case of air piracy in American aviation history. The escape from Alcatraz. Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary occupied a rocky island in San Francisco Bay for 29 years. Its reputation was absolute. No one escaped from Alcatraz. The cold water, the strong currents, the distance to shore, the island itself was the security system. On the night of the 11th of June, 1962, 3 inmates, Frank Morris and brothers John and Clarence Anglin, were not in their cells at morning count. They had spent months preparing. Using spoons and a homemade drill fashioned from a vacuum cleaner motor, they had chipped away at the concrete around the ventilation grills in their cells. They had constructed papier-mâché dummy heads, complete with real human hair from the prison barbershop, which they left in their beds to fool the guards during night checks. They climbed to the roof through a utility corridor, reached the water's edge, and launched a raft made of over 50 raincoats stitched together. Then they paddled into the dark bay. They were never seen again. The official position of the FBI and the U.S. Marshals Service, who continue to list the Anglin brothers as wanted fugitives, is that the 3 men most likely drowned in the cold bay. No confirmed evidence of their survival has ever been produced. But in 2013, the U.S. Marshals received a letter, purportedly from John Anglin, claiming that all three had survived. The letter was unverified. A 2015 photo emerged suggesting two men resembling the Anglin brothers living in Brazil. It was inconclusive. Three men who planned meticulously, executed perfectly, and then either drowned in the bay or lived out quiet lives somewhere under different names. The bay has never said which. The lead masks case. On the 20th of August, 1966, a boy flying a kite on the Morro do Vintum hillside near Niterói, Brazil, discovered two bodies. The men were dressed in formal suits and waterproof coats, lying side by side, with no signs of physical trauma. Beside them were an empty water bottle, two wet towels, and a small notepad. On each man's face was a homemade lead mask, the kind used by workers handling radioactive materials to protect their eyes. The men were identified as Miguel José Viana and Manuel Pereira da Cruz, both electronic technicians from the nearby town of Campos. They had left home 3 days earlier, telling family members they had a job to do and would return quickly. The notepad contained a brief instruction: 16:30 be at the agreed place. 18:30 ingest capsules. After effect protect metals wait for mask signal. Toxicology tests at the time were inconclusive. The samples were not preserved properly, and by the time the significance of the case was appreciated, the opportunity to test for many substances had passed. What were the capsules? What was the mask signal? What agreed place? The two men appear to have been participants in some kind of ritual or experiment, possibly connected to a spiritualist group, of which there were many in Brazil at the time. Spiritism and UFO-related belief communities were both active in the region, and some researchers have suggested the men believed they were attempting to make contact with extraterrestrial beings. No one has ever explained what happened on that hillside. No organization has come forward. No survivor of whatever ritual or meeting was planned has been identified. Two men in suits, lead masks on their faces, waiting on a hillside for a signal that apparently never came. Cosmic and existential mysteries. Through the ruins of the ancient world and the wreckage of empires. Through lost libraries and unread scripts. Through ghost ships and phantom islands. Through crimes that were never answered and people who were never explained. We end where all questions eventually lead, at the largest edge of all. Not history this time. Not humanity. Something bigger. The cosmos. The question of whether we are alone. And a return, at the very end, to the oldest myths, the ones that started everything, asking them one final time with fresh eyes. The wow signal. On the 15th of August, 1977, a radio telescope at Ohio State University was scanning the sky as part of the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, the SETI program. The telescope was called Big Ear, and it spent its days and nights listening to the electromagnetic spectrum, looking for patterns that might suggest an artificial origin, something that could not have been produced by a star, a nebula, or any known natural phenomenon. For most of its operation, Big Ear heard nothing that qualified. And then, for 72 seconds, it heard something. The signal was so strong and so precisely aligned with the frequency theorized to be the most likely used by an intelligent civilization, the hydrogen line, at 1420 MHz, that the astronomer who reviewed the computer printout the following day circled it in red pen and wrote a single word in the margin: wow. The wow signal remains the strongest candidate for an extraterrestrial transmission ever detected. It came from the direction of the constellation Sagittarius. It lasted exactly as long as it would take the rotating beam of the telescope to sweep past a fixed point in space. It has never been detected again, despite numerous attempts. What was it? Natural explanations have been proposed: a comet's hydrogen cloud, a terrestrial radio interference source, an instrumental anomaly. None has been fully satisfying. A 2022 study proposed that 2 comets known to have been in that region of the sky could account for the signal. Other researchers dispute this. 72 seconds. One circled printout. A question aimed at the whole of the cosmos that the cosmos has not yet answered. We are still listening. The Kensington Runestone. In 1898, a Swedish-American farmer named Olof Öhman was clearing land near the town of Kensington in Minnesota when he found a flat stone slab tangled in the roots of a tree. The stone was covered in runic inscriptions. When translated, the text told a startling story. A party of Scandinavian explorers, 8 Goths and 22 Norwegians, had traveled from Vinland into the interior of North America in 1362, and had found 10 of their companions dead at their campsite, killed in a single day. If authentic, the Kensington Runestone would be evidence of a pre-Columbian Scandinavian expedition penetrating hundreds of miles into the North American interior over a century before Columbus's voyage, an extraordinary rewriting of the known history of the Americas. The stone was examined almost immediately and dismissed by most scholars as a forgery. The runes included letters that were supposedly not used in medieval Scandinavia, and the language was held to be inconsistent with 14th century Norse. But the case has never been definitively closed. Some linguists and runologists have argued that the forms used on the stone are consistent with regional Scandinavian dialect variants of the period. Geological analysis of the weathering on the stone has been cited by supporters as evidence of genuine age. The stone sits in a museum in Alexandria, Minnesota, where it has become something of a local icon, the subject of passionate advocacy and equally passionate dismissal, with no authoritative final verdict. A stone found in a Minnesota field. A story of Norsemen, far from the sea, in a land they were not supposed to have reached. Real or invented, either answer raises its own questions. The Oak Island Treasure. Off the coast of Nova Scotia, Canada, there is a small island where people have been digging for over 200 years. The Oak Island Treasure mystery began in 1795, when a teenager named Daniel McGinnis noticed a circular depression in the ground beneath an oak tree and, with 2 friends, began to dig. They found a shaft lined with logs at regular intervals, suggesting deliberate construction. They also found, reportedly, a flat stone with a coded inscription. They could not reach the bottom. As they dug deeper, water flooded the shaft. Subsequent excavations over the next 2 centuries have encountered the same problem. An elaborate system of flood tunnels appears to have been engineered to fill the shaft with seawater whenever digging reaches a certain depth. 6 people have died in Oak Island excavation attempts. The shaft has consumed enormous amounts of money and decades of effort from successive generations of treasure hunters. What is at the bottom? Theories have ranged from pirate treasure. Captain Kidd is a popular candidate, to the original manuscripts of Shakespeare's plays, to Templar treasure, to the Holy Grail itself. None of these has been substantiated. Some skeptics have argued that the flood tunnels may be entirely natural, geological formations that behave like engineered drainage systems without being engineered at all, and that the entire treasure story grew from a naturally occurring phenomenon combined with 2 centuries of wishful thinking. Others point to artifacts recovered from the site, coins, a fragment of parchment, pieces of worked metal, as evidence that something genuinely unusual was buried there. A hole in the ground that fills with water every time someone tries to reach the bottom. The most expensive and found treasure in history. And the question, always the question, of whether there is anything there at all. The lost treasure of the Knights Templar. Revisited. We spoke of the Knights Templar earlier in this journey, of their sudden destruction in 1307, of the fleet that vanished from La Rochelle overnight, of the treasury that was gone before the arrests were made. We return to them now, at the end, because their mystery has a quality that few others in this list share. It may never be resolved, not because the evidence was lost, but because the evidence may have been deliberately and expertly destroyed. The Templars were, among other things, extraordinary administrators. They built the first international banking network. They maintained detailed records. They knew, better than almost any organization of their era, how to move money and assets quietly across borders. If they chose to hide something, they would have known how to hide it well. The enduring power of the Templar treasure mystery is not really about gold. It is about what the gold represents, the idea that somewhere, perhaps beneath a church or a hill or an island, the accumulated secrets of a 200-year-old organization of warrior monks lie waiting, intact, for someone to find. The idea that history has a hidden room. That the official story has a locked door. That somewhere, the real version of things is still preserved. That impulse, to believe in a hidden room, may be one of the most deeply human things there is. The lost Ark of the Covenant, revisited. We spoke of the Ark of the Covenant earlier too, of the moment it simply stepped out of the biblical narrative and never stepped back in. Of the Ethiopian tradition that claims it still exists, tended by a single monk in a chapel in Aksum, never to be seen by outside eyes. We return to it now because, at the end of a journey through 100 mysteries, it feels like one of the truest. Not because the Ark is necessarily real in the physical sense, though it may be. Not because the Ethiopian guardian is certainly telling the truth, though he may be. But because the Ark represents something that runs beneath almost every mystery we have discussed tonight. The idea that the most sacred things are also the most hidden. That what matters most is often what cannot be seen, verified, or touched. The Ark was the dwelling place of the divine presence. Its whole purpose was to house something that could not be housed, to give a location, a container, a form to something that by its nature exceeds all containers. And then it disappeared. As though the thing it contained had simply outgrown it and moved on. Perhaps that is what all the best mysteries are, in the end. Containers for something too large to fit. Questions that point toward answers bigger than the questions themselves. The Ark is somewhere. Or it is nowhere. Either way, what it pointed toward remains. The lost city of Atlantis, final return. We began with the ancient world. We end with the most ancient story of all. Atlantis. A magnificent civilization, at the height of its power, swallowed by the sea in a single day and night. Gone so completely that not a stone, not a coin, not a carving has ever been confirmed as its remnant. Present only in the words of a philosopher who may have invented it entirely. We know, now, having traveled through this whole long night, that the world is full of things that vanished without trace. The Minoan civilization, nearly destroyed by Thera's eruption. The great coastal cities swallowed by rising seas at the end of the last ice age. The lost library of Alexandria, whose catalogue we cannot reconstruct. The scripts we cannot read. The tombs we cannot find. The world swallows things. It always has. And sometimes, perhaps, a civilization vanishes so completely that only the shape of its absence remains. A story told by people who felt, without being able to say exactly why, that something tremendous had once existed and was now gone. Maybe Atlantis is not a place. Maybe Atlantis is the feeling. The feeling that comes when you stand at the edge of the ocean and look out at the horizon, and something in you recognizes, without language, without logic, that what lies beneath the water is vast and old and full of things that were once here and are now gone. Every civilization that ever built something beautiful and then lost it is Atlantis. every library that burned, every language that fell silent, every name that was forgotten. The mystery of Atlantis is the mystery of everything we have spoken of tonight. And that is why it belongs at the end. We have reached the end. Ancient civilizations and vanished knowledge. The ruins of empires and the footprints they left in the dark. Ghost ships and phantom islands. Scripts no living person can read. Objects that should not exist. People who appeared without origin and disappeared without explanation. And along the way, a few questions that turned out to have answers after all. Sailing stones guided by ice and wind. A ghost army of artists, painting the world's largest illusion. An iron pillar whose secret was chemistry all along. The world is not only mysterious. It also, sometimes, quietly explains itself. But most of what we covered tonight remains open. The tablets unread. The tombs unfound. The names unknown. The faces unidentified. The questions that have waited thousands of years, and will wait longer still. There is something peaceful in that, if you let yourself feel it. The not knowing is not a failure. It is simply the honest condition of being a curious mind in a vast and complicated world. We are small. The world is old. The questions are larger than any of us. And that is all right. Thank you for watching till the end. Please don't forget to like, share and subscribe to my channel, A Quick History of Time.